All right. Call the meeting back to order. Next item on our agenda is Wyoming property tax demographics. We have Director Henson back with us. Director Henson, thanks for joining us again after lunch, and please proceed with your presentation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Brenda Henson, Director of the Department of Revenue, and I've been asked to just go over some basic numbers that just kind of would provide an idea of what makes up our tax base in Wyoming. Who's paying property taxes? How are we paying for our services, and what services are being provided? So I hope that this presentation not only provides answers, but causes you to perhaps do further research as it relates to your own taxing authorities within your own jurisdictions. So we'll go ahead and get started. Obviously, who pays property tax? Well, it's a property tax. So anyone who owns property, homeowners, business owners, manufacturers, ag producers, public utilities, mineral producing companies, landowners, equipment owners. Bottom line, if you own property, you're probably paying property tax unless there's an exemption that's been granted by the legislature. And it's important to note that every exemption that's on the books for property tax was granted by the legislature. We want to talk about property, real and personal. Legally, there are only two types of property. Real property being land and appurtenances, that includes structures, anything that's actually affixed to that land. And what I like to think of it as is, if I get a deed, I've acquired a property and I get a deed, what comes with that deed? Any structures? You know, I'm not going to get a bill of sale for the structures. So any structure that's affixed to that land, I receive ownership of those structures when I get a deed. Now, on the other side, personal property, we've got tangible. Mr. Gill talked about tangible and intangible personal property. Those are the types of things that typically transfer by a title or a bill of sale. But you're not going to transfer ownership of personal property via a deed. So the exemption, I think Ken had mentioned that on intangible, we have a specific exemption that states that intangible personal property is exempt from property taxation. Most of the information that I'm going to present is real specific to real property because Mr. Gill covered personal property in depth this morning. So we're going to talk about, you know, that land, the structures, you know, manufacturers, data centers, the shed, that's considered real property, businesses. So personal property, again, some of those items that were shared this morning. But bottom line, who's paying property tax in Wyoming? These numbers and most of the numbers in this presentation are related to the 2023 tax year because that's the most recent where we have full numbers. Every year this changes, these percentages that we're going to talk about. So in 2023, the highest percentage of assessed value in relationship to the total assessed value was residential. Residential represented the almost 29% of our total assessed value. Right behind that, you saw oil production, natural gas production, and notice I said the word production. All of those areas that are highlighted in light blue, that is simply ad valorem property taxes on that mineral that's produced and severed. Then as we go on down, you'll see industrial there at the $2.3 billion, about 6.9% of our total assessed value, and then decreasing from there. So all of the items, so you got residential, commercial at the 2.2 million, and then agricultural is just agricultural land. I did want to point out that when we think about agricultural property in Wyoming, that is just producing land. If you have a house on an agricultural property, that value is included in the residential value on this chart. If you have outbuildings, grain bins, those are commercial structures, and they're included in the commercial valuation piece. So the residential at the top, there's going to be land and structures, but for agricultural, that's just the land. So when we talk about the historical assessed values on oil and gas, we've heard about
Director
it.
Henson, can I pause you
Yes.
1 second? It looks like we have a question for you from Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and sorry to interrupt your presentation, but you just covered the point that I wanted to ask you about, and that is this residential portion of ag, and I've had several constituents call and ask about this, and if you could just clarify, when there isn't a fence surrounding the home, how is it determined what it is? I believe it's a 1 acre minimum. Is that, or that's the standard? Is that what we do as assessors?
Director?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bear, that is a standard, and that basically came about when we had the legislation that created the land under farmstead structures and how it shall be valued as agricultural land. So we had to have some way of identifying. Really, the way it should work is for a parcel of ground, you've got agricultural land that's in production, whether it's dry crop, range ground, or irrigated.
Right.
Anything that's not in production then falls to whether it's residential because the house was on there, or commercial because there's a commercial structure. It's just basically those acreages were determined by default by saying it's not in production, so it's residential. We don't have a classification in Wyoming that's other lands. We don't have anything that's vacant land. If it doesn't have a use, where do we throw it? Is it residential, commercial, industrial? If it's zoned, we can use that as a determination. But I think the key is that those vacant lands that we have in Wyoming, particularly on these agricultural parcels, sometimes it all gets thrown into that residential classification just as a default that it's not ag. I hope that answers your question. Okay, with that, we're going to talk about the oil and gas industry. Because remember on the slide before, I basically provided you with the information that over $17 billion in assessed value was related to the produced mineral. And keeping in mind 2023 taxes, those values are actually 2022 production on minerals. Okay, so let's look at this slide a little bit, because what it tells you is in 2023, in addition to the $17 billion that the mineral industry paid on produced minerals, just the oil and gas industry itself had an assessed value of over $1 billion on land, equipment. This is in addition to the over 50% of the assessed value. The reason this is important is because, as we know, the tax base in Wyoming is changing. And as we're going to see in some of the following slides, as that changes through time, whenever the mineral values go down, the percentage that residential or commercial or industrial contribute to the overall assessed value, those percentages go up. So in this chart, historical percentage of total assessed value per property type, I've gone back to the year 2010. And if you go back to 2012, you'll see that in 2012, of our total assessed value, 64.12% was mineral production. This is just mineral production at the bottom of this slide. For 2023, we saw it go back up to 50.75% of our total assessed value. But if you look at 2021, what was going on during that time period? Negative oil. And because 2021 tax year is 2020 production year. So we saw a definite decrease. And we were also at that time hearing about conceptually increasing the level of assessment to make up for the shortfalls. So all I'm saying is, as a legislative body, there's a great deal of responsibility there in that you cannot consider the amount of assessed value that residential contributes to the overall tax base without looking at mineral value and how that. So in 2012, only 16.63% of our total assessed value was residential. Why? Because the mineral values were high. As the mineral values decrease, we will continue to see the portion of residential assessed value be a larger portion of our property tax base. And this is statewide, keeping in mind that the only mill levy that applies to every assessed dollar statewide is the 12 mills to the school foundation.
Director, question for you from Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, this timeframe of 2019 through 2021, where we see this decrease, or 2018, actually into 2022 for oil and gas, what about natural gas? I mean, we saw $50 a therm compared to $2.50 a therm, and we had a huge revenue increase from that. How does that play into here? Is that part of this 40-some%?
Director?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bear, absolutely. And not only do we see fluctuations between tax years, but being responsible for mineral valuation, we all know in 2023 and 2022, we were seeing huge fluctuations from month to month. And so those are important to understand. And it's important to understand that for minerals, while we assess the year after the year of production, we're doing the estimated ad valorem, we're getting amended returns all of the time. Anytime you see all of this information as a 1 year to the next, you need to understand that was a picture of that day when the State Board of Equalization certified values. Our laws require that those are the values that we have to use to establish mill levies in the budget process. But this is a moving target. Just because it says X dollars were generated, that fluctuates because producers have 3 years from the date that they severed that mineral to amend their returns. Some go up, some go down. We have litigation that may affect those values, but this is really the only way that we have to gauge this from year to year as a comparison. So hopefully that helps. So those percentages, they speak for themselves. Related to industrial, so everything on this sheet of paper, so agricultural land, residential, commercial, all being assessed at 9.5% of fair market value. The industrial line at 11.5% throughout this entire time. The state assessed non-minerals, we've got telecoms that are at 9.5% that are department assessed. We've got public utilities that are at 11.5%, so it's a mix. Railroads are 11.5%. The minerals, of course, are all at 100% of value.
Representative Bear?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, this is a nice chart, and I understand what you're trying to illustrate as far as the mix that makes up our revenue. What would also be helpful over the same time frame to put next to those numbers, and I'm sorry, I'm back on the previous chart.
That's okay.
Would be to see what the actual total revenues were and what the percentage increases were year over year. So as the mix changes, we would be, is it possible to get this same information with the overall revenue to the state?
Director?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, we'll get into some other slides here in a minute, but if you wish, you can take those assessed values, multiply them by 12 mills. That's how much the school fund got that year. If you want to multiply it by 25 mills, that assessed value times the 25 mills, that's how much went to the local school districts. So you can make that calculation on any of those so if you're doing the 12 mills for the schools, okay, I'm not getting to your answer, I can tell.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, yeah, I'm not asking for the dollar amount for each of those. I'm asking for the overall total revenue. If the revenue increased and the mix changed, it would help explain that this particular tax, residential property taxes, for instance, has increased well beyond the loss that we had in minerals potentially, or something like that. You can't tell by this picture here whether the state had an overall loss or an overall gain during that time frame.
Next chart kind of shows the assessed value.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, and if I do not answer your question throughout this presentation, I will definitely visit with you online.
Thank you.
On site. So the next chart, looking at the Wyoming assessed values, that's, again, you could take any of these. For education, that total assessed value that's in the middle column, if you multiply that by 0.012, that'll tell you how much was generated each of those years for the school foundation. So you've got some years that decreased. For example, 2009 to 2010, the overall was a negative 27.05%. Now, I will tell you, this is mostly due to mineral fluctuations. But what's interesting about assessed values, if you look back to 2015, you'll see that our assessed value in 2015 was 26 billion plus. We just got back to that point in 2022 at 26.5 billion. We saw a big increase in 2023, but it was related to the mineral industry. If we go to the next slide, this is the important piece that shows the volatility of our tax structure in Wyoming. The blue line, that's the mineral production values going back to 2000. The red line, that's everything else. That's ag, residential, commercial, industrial. That's really steady. That is a property, if mineral values were not included in our assessed value, we would have seen a fairly steady. Now, agreed, we did see from that 2019, 2020, 2021, that's the increase in the residential that we saw. But this is why when all of our property tax structure is so reliant on total assessed value, why minerals is something that we have to deal with every year. So let's talk about who are those Wyoming taxpayers. So July 2023, our population, 584,000 people. Persons under 18 years old, about 22%. So I kind of like to think of those as our school age folks. Persons 65 years and over, 18.6%. 42,651 veterans in Wyoming. We definitely have a situation where many servicemen and women come back to Wyoming to live. So that's important. And licensed drivers, about 430,000. Let's look at the age groups. So the next slide from the Census Bureau. So red is Wyoming. Blue is for the United States. So when you look at that 60 to 64, 65 to 69, we are definitely outgrowing what the United States are as far as that 65 and older population. Why is that important? We had some property tax relief that was focused on those folks, right? So it'll be interesting as we continue to age in Wyoming, how much of a tax relief that particular piece of legislation provides. The only place where we are growing slower is that 45 to 49. And then in that age group, we're growing slower than the nation. Okay. So housing units, 277,116 based on census. But then they also count households. And then we looked at this piece of living in the same house 1 year plus. So almost 84%, 8 out of 10 homes, the folks that are living there were living there a year ago. We don't have any information further back than that. And so as we look at these residency requirements on some of the property tax relief we've had it's interesting. Some of our bills that have been put in place require 3-year residency. Some require a 5-year residency. Some require, in order to qualify as your residence, that you have to live in that home over 9 months out of the year. Another tax relief says the majority of the year. I believe one of the bills we just passed said 8 months out of the year. So we've got all of these moving pieces to qualify for some of these tax relief programs. Owner occupied, 71.9%. As we are working on fiscal notes, both the LSO office and my office, as different bills come up, we're using the census numbers to determine, okay, if we've got X number of properties, approximately how many are owner occupied. But that's the number if the owner occupied subclass were to go in place, that we really need to think about administration of a bill that would require almost 72%, 7 out of every 10 property owners to actually apply for some sort of relief. So this one I found particularly interesting. When we talk about statewide numbers, the more we drill down, the more we know everything is different in various counties. So you'll see owner-occupied housing in Albany County is only 49.3%. That makes sense in Albany County, our college town. The next one, Teton County, only 58.7% owner-occupied homes in Teton. Interestingly enough, when we look at Laramie County and Natrona County, the most populous counties in our state, they're both right around that 68% owner-occupied. And then you can see Crook County, an agricultural community, 82% owner-occupied. Why is this important? Because if you're providing property tax relief and it's focused on owner-occupied, those jurisdictions, tax authorities, that their tax base is mainly owner-occupied residential property, this is going to hit their budgets more than Albany County's budget. This was somewhat interesting to me, the number of people in the households. So in Albany County, only 2.3, because you've got students that are renting out properties. But the highest would be the Sublette County at 2.8. But from lowest to highest, we're only talking 2 people in a residence to 2.8 in a residence. Why is that important? Remember, our property tax refund program is based on household income. The majority of our households in Wyoming have 2 people residing in those homes. Okay, let's go on to the CAMA information. Again, opportunity for me to say thank you to the legislature those decades ago when you determined that it was so important that property taxation be done uniformly throughout this state, that you funded a statewide CAMA system. This slide, in other states, in order to get this information, I would have to send out a survey to county assessors and ask them to tell me how many of those do they have. In Wyoming, we query this information. So in 2023, we had 315,000 real property accounts. That's including all the different classifications. 37,000 agricultural properties, meaning that property had some sort of producing agricultural land. 216,000 single-family residential. 3,200 multifamily properties. Outbuildings, 260,000. If any of you ever want to crunch numbers, if you go to the Department of Revenue website, under the Property Tax Division, you can get a CAMA download of 2023 data. In that CAMA download, you can see every structure in the state of Wyoming, the year it was built, what's the square footage. All of that information is public information. As you know, the only thing that's not public in Wyoming is sale price and the confidentiality that we talked about on the personal property and any reports that a taxpayer provides. But I could tell you how many 1,200 square foot houses are in Wyoming. That's the type of information the CAMA system affords us, and information for you as policymakers to consider. Commercial properties, 27,000. And I've broken them down: retail, office, warehouse, lodging, food service, multifamily, 4 units or more, and then approximately 1,700 industrial properties. So it would be interesting. The WCDA did a housing analysis, and they actually do a report that tells you what's the age of our housing inventory in Wyoming. You know, how many properties, I mean, if you've got a house that's 50 years old, you know that you've either got to remodel or do something, or it's, you know, going to fall apart. That's what that study did. And I'm sure that all of the committees that are working on housing in Wyoming are looking at these existing structures and how do you make them habitable again. But that's the type of data that we can get out of the CAMA system. Now, I will tell you, this is taxable property only. So there's a lot of government-owned buildings. For example, the housing authorities in each of our counties, they own multiple residential properties, but they're exempt from property taxation. So housing authority parcels are not included in the data in the CAMA system. So just make sure everybody understands the limitations. You can't share data unless you understand what the numbers represent, and I always try and make sure that I'm clear. Taxing authorities. So in 2024, we have 608 tax authorities. And for anyone who has seen this slide in my prior presentations, you'll know that we're down 4 taxing authorities from 2023. What were they? Improvement and service districts. You know, we talk about how taxes, or how we as citizens pool our money to pay for infrastructure and services we cannot afford on our own. Improvement and service districts are just that. That's where a group of homeowners in a subdivision say, you know, they want their roads to have asphalt on their roads. They want to borrow the money to do so, so they create an improvement and service district. They elect a board, they get a loan, and then they pay that back over 10 years or whatever the time period of that loan is. And that's what an improvement and service district is. Well, we lost 4 of those because they paid off their bonds. No longer needed that property tax dollar. Sometimes we have, and there's a significant number of this 143 improvement and service districts that are still existing, but they don't have a loan, but they want to continue. They want to continue to have a board and continue to be active. They don't want to dissolve because 10 years from now, they may want to repave the road, and they don't want to go through the process of creating an improvement and service district. So they continue to be active. They're just not levying a tax. And so those are the types of things that from year to year really impact the amount of tax dollars that's collected. So let's go on to, where do property taxes collected go? Statewide. So now that we've already talked about who was paying those taxes, but where did those tax dollars go? 19% to the school foundation, that's the 12 mills. 41% to school districts, that's the 25 mills. And then not just the 25, but we've got BOCES mills. We've got, if there's bonds that need to be repaid, that would be part of the school district. There's a rec district. School districts can levy a mill for recreation. They can levy a mill for adult education. That's all included in that 41% for school districts. The county school funding, that's the 6 mills that goes to the county school, and then community college at 4%. But if we add all of those that are related to education, that's 73% of our property taxes statewide go to education. And you will find that that is how other states fund education as well. Property tax is that stable source in most states, and that is why education is typically used to fund it. Now, what you don't see in this pie chart is state government, because not a penny of property taxes paid goes to the state general fund. The only way that there's a relationship between property taxes paid and the state general fund is when, based on the basket of goods, the state has to come up with any shortfall to pay for education. That's different than this piece that says, where do your property tax dollars go to? Okay. Every county is different. The next screen shows the county and the mills that they've levied, the grand total of municipal levies, the total special district taxes. So for counties, you're looking at 17.48% of the tax dollars collected. Municipalities, 1.84%. The other important thing to note about municipalities, they're not worried about those fluctuations in mineral values. Why? Very few municipalities or towns have a producing coal mine or oil field in them. So their assessed values are really focused on the other properties. Special district class taxes, again, those are on that slide before. I showed all those different types of cemetery districts, hospital districts. So that's where that money's coming from, and then the total all education. For a total of about almost $2.2 billion that were collected for 2023 property taxes. But I said that each taxing authority is different, and I find this fascinating. So on the left-hand side here, I've got the counties listed and the percent of residential assessed value for each of those counties. On the right-hand side, I've displayed the county seat in each of those counties and what percentage of residential value their tax base is comprised of. So you look at Campbell County, 6.57% of its assessed value is residential, but Gillette, 63.13% of their value is residential. Converse County, 3.27% countywide, but in Douglas, 67.6% of their assessed value directly comes from residential. Sweetwater County, 10.48%, Green River, 82.36% of their value is residential. So as we talk about these property tax relief measures that are out there reducing the residential assessed value with no backfill, these cities, towns, those are the folks that are going to be watching those budget amounts closely.
Representative Bear?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Henson, this doesn't, obviously this is about property taxes we're talking about right now, but can you just bring into the conversation sales tax and how that affects these two columns? Because in my community where you've just mentioned, sales tax is almost non-existent in the county, but there's a tremendous amount of sales tax collected in the county seat. So could you give us an idea of how that works across the state?
Director?
Mr. Chairman, if I may defer that to our discussion tomorrow, when we're really delving into sales tax and how it's distributed, and because there's the two-piece, there's the local options, and then there's the state 4% and how we distribute that. I don't have the numbers right offhand, but you're right. It's going to be different based on the population of each of those jurisdictions. So it's an excellent point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it safe to say that it could offset the difference that you're seeing in that community?
Director?
Mr. Chairman, it could. Sales tax is also volatile. Again, Teton County, 86.68% of the assessed value for Teton County, but interestingly enough, in Jackson, 62% of their assessed value is residential. I think we all know why that is as well. So I took the liberty of adding in some health-related 2023. We hear a lot about insurance costs, healthcare costs. One of the questions was related to how, what property tax dollars are being spent to help our seniors. Again, we were looking at the age factor. So we've got rural healthcare districts. We've got 5 of those, 6.1 million. Again, these were all formed by a vote of the people. We've also got hospital districts that levied a total of $55 million in property taxes last year. We've got senior citizen service districts, about $4.8 million. Those aren't significant numbers, but when you look at these jurisdictions, those tax dollars are significant to them to provide the services to the seniors that they're required to. Community colleges, you know, this is interesting. Property taxes do not fund the University of Wyoming in any way, shape, or form, but they do fund community colleges. So as you know, we've added the Gillette Community College District recently. So all of those that are colored, those are your counties that have community college districts. And I've included in the slide the levies for the community colleges. So if you look at the very first column, community college operating, they can levy up to 4 mills for operating. Every community college levies the 4 mills except for Campbell County, and they're only levying 2.5 mills. But isn't that interesting? In Campbell County, 2.5 mills generates $15 million. The 4 mills in any of the other 7 counties don't generate as much as Campbell County can generate with 2.5 mills.
And Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
If Ms. Hens can tell us why that is.
Director?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Swanitzer, that would be the mineral values in Campbell County and just the total assessed value. We just don't have that mineral wealth in the other counties. Another topic of discussion has always been, is this the appropriate manner to fund our community colleges? It's only property owners that own property in the counties where those community colleges exist that pay the mills for community colleges. And in some instances, particularly when you've got bonds and interests that are also being accrued, we've got residents in our counties that are paying 6, 7 mills to the community college. What would that look like if we funded our community colleges statewide? Topic for another day. But anytime you spread out the tax base, the mill levy can come down and you're generating the same amount of tax dollars. So just another subject. But community
Director.
colleges are important because what are they? They're the education system for economic development.
Director, looking at slide 24, I think it's the previous slide. Co-chairman and I were looking at all the blank white spaces. So for the public's knowledge, they don't pay taxes to the community colleges. Only where you see these colors are those residents paying into the community college. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it's important to note that we have a presence of a community college in all counties across the state.
Yes. Representative Northrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it'd also be important to note that with online instruction, that the whole state's able to take advantage of the community college programs.
Indeed.
That's correct.
All right. Thank you.
It would probably be an interesting subject for those 8 counties that are property owners that are currently paying to a community college, but not so popular to the other counties that aren't paying a mill levy to the community colleges. All right, so let's talk about 2023 taxes paid. And now, I am limited. So just looking out the window, you know, we've got different taxing districts in Natrona County. And depending on where your property is located and which taxing entities have the authority to levy their tax on what that mill levy is, I can't drill down to every taxing district to break it out. So I have used the statewide average mill levy and used the assessed value. So the mineral industry, that $1.3 billion in taxes, that is property tax related to production and looking at their personal property and real property that they own. Residential taxpayers, $677 million. But keep in mind, what you've got is the mineral industry. That's almost double what the residents in Wyoming pay on residential property tax. So as the volatility continues to exist in the mineral industry, just always something to ensure we keep in mind. Department assessed, non-mineral, that's the railroads, public utilities, telecoms, cable TV. That's the $131 million in taxes. Other industrial taxpayers, about 34 million. Commercial taxpayers, 155 million. Ag land property, the 28 million. Again, that doesn't include their houses and their structures. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions. What I have included is just a 2024 tax calendar, important dates, just so you can have it, so that you recognize how this budget process works. You know, we're the end of May right now, that we've got taxing entities that right now are putting together their budgets for the tax year 2024, which is their fiscal year 2025. They're holding public hearings. Every taxing authority holds a public hearing to present their budget. And anyone who owns property that's paying those taxes has a voice in that budget process. Even attending school board meetings, where are they spending the 25 mils? Attending your weed and pest budget meetings. If you are concerned as a taxpayer about how your tax dollars are being spent, the place to look is the budgets, and to be vocal about those budgets. They do a proposed budget. Those proposed budgets are posted on the local county website, and then they post when their public meeting is going to be, and then they post their final budget. The final budget is where we calculate mill levies. And I mentioned before that when the State Board of Equalization certifies values, that has to be used for mill levy purposes. So a fire district, they put their budget together. They say, we need $200,000 from property tax to provide these services. 200,000 divided by the assessed value calculates a mill levy. If it calculates out to be 2.5 mills, that's all they levy. They have a maximum of 3. Let's say they needed $300,000, but based on their assessed value, they could levy 250,000 on 3 mills, and that's it. Well, then that's all they get. We have a constitutional cap on our mill levies for every taxing entity out there. Other states, many other states don't have that cap on mill levies. It's simply a calculation of budget divided by assessed value equals a mill levy. And when the assessed values go down, the mill levies go up. When the assessed values go up, the mill levies go down. But we don't have that type of a structure. And because our minerals are included in our assessed value, that makes us much unlike any other state on our property tax levy calculation. But that's why these dates are important. July 31st, government entities provide the county commissioners with the total amount to be collected. August 5th, the county commissioners levy the necessary taxes, and then on or before October 10th, county treasurers send out those tax bills. And so with that, I'll answer any questions that you may have. I hope that this has given you some food for thought. And if you don't think of your question today, you know what number is 777-3677.
As always, thank you, Director. Thank you so much. That was great. Any questions for Director Henson? Any questions? You must have done a good job. Thank you, Director. Looks like Dean Temte from LSO is up next. Mr. Temte, make your way on down.
Done, right? I think we're done.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Weidman, Co-Chairman Harshman. My name is Dean Temte. I work in the Budget Fiscal Division of the Legislative Service Office. LSO staff had received a request for comparable information, how Wyoming property taxes compare with other states. And that's what I am here to try to provide to you today. This does pertain to a specific handout, and that handout is shown up on the screen. There are only 5 pages to this handout. I will be discussing the comparison of Wyoming with the 50 states, but also displayed on this handout are Wyoming's surrounding states and the state of North Dakota. I went ahead and included North Dakota just because North Dakota is similar to Wyoming in several ways, demographically, as far as their population as well. They also are one of the larger mineral producing states, which makes them pretty comparable to Wyoming. So I chose to include them in this comparison. The information I used for this comparison came from a report, and it's a report you've probably heard of before. It's called the 50-State Property Tax Comparison Study, and this study is released by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and the Minnesota Center for Fiscal Excellence. I would point out that the data that Director Henson was talking about corresponded to tax year 2023. I actually talked to the Minnesota Center of Fiscal Excellence, and they are reviewing the report that pertains to tax year 23 as we speak, but it will not be released for a couple months. So I will be going over the information which was included in the comparison for tax year 2022. The reason I chose this study to use as the comparison is it is the most comprehensive study that I have found on property tax, comparing property taxes among the 50 states. One unique thing about this report, it not only includes, you do find a lot of studies and comparisons in regard to homestead residential property taxes, but you don't find very many studies that also try to compare commercial property taxes and industrial property taxes, and this study does. So that's why I chose this study to provide you comparison information. The information in these slides, they will look very similar. You will notice they will all provide something called an effective tax rate. And the effective tax rate is basically calculated by taking the tax bill, the bottom line tax bill for the property tax divided by the fair market value of the property. And the reason this particular metric is used is because there is a pretty broad spectrum of property tax assessment methodologies across our 50 states. And this particular metric was used in order to try to boil it down to something that could be comparable, that you could actually compare one state to another. Another interesting thing about this particular study, what it does, it draws comparisons across the largest city in each state. So which Cheyenne is one of them. This study is interesting, though. It also includes property taxes for the District of Columbia, and it actually also includes 2 of the largest cities for the state of New York and for the state of Illinois. And the reason for that is that apparently New York cities and the city of Chicago, their tax metric is very unique among themselves. So those particular cities are included in addition to the next largest city in each one of those states. So in the comparisons, there's certainly the And the way the rankings work is the higher the effective tax rate, the highest effective tax rate was assigned a rank of number 1, with the lowest effective rate and lowest property tax bill was assigned a rank of 53. So with that, I'll get started in looking at the first page in the comparison information I provided. And this includes Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. They're just listed in alphabetical order here with the specific effective tax rates and the particular ranks. And I would say this is a report which has been coming out for several years now. This is actually a report which we've been looking at LSO for several years now. And I'll just give you an idea. The way Wyoming has been ranking hasn't changed a lot from 2016 to 2022, but it has changed some. On this first page, you can see the effective tax rates and the particular tax bill amounts. Among the 8 states, you will see Wyoming is ranked 43rd nationally, so 43 out of 53, which is still on the low side. I would indicate to you, though, that in 2016, actually, Cheyenne's ranking was number 49. So Wyoming's rankings in this study have been the property tax in comparison for Wyoming has been increasing somewhat. It's still towards the lower end of the spectrum, but it has been increasing somewhat. And the reason for that is the actions of other states to try to address their increasing property tax issues as well. This has certainly been an issue that has pretty much taken place nationwide. Almost all 50 states, I would say, has been grappling with the increase in market value of properties and the corresponding market value of the increase in property tax burdens. So, like I said, for that reason, that is one reason why some states are starting to now be ranked, have a lower ranking than Wyoming, where Wyoming was once one of the lowest. As you can see in this, Wyoming's effective tax rate, and again, this is the tax bill divided by the market value, was 0.645% for tax year 22. And to just give you a point of reference for tax year 22, the average effective tax rate in 2022 across all 50 states was 1.321%, or actually 1.2% for this particular metric that I'm using. The metric that I'm using here is homestead property taxes for the largest city in each state, and also a listing of the median home values. And this particular comparison includes the assessment limits. For example, the 2024 legislature, you guys passed an assessment limit, 2024 House Bill 45, which limited the increase in assessment to 4% on improvements. And then also in tax year 2025, it will begin to limit the increase on the assessment of the related land as well. So just to give you a point of reference, actually, Wyoming's 0.645 effective rate, comparing to the average in the country of 1.2%, it's barely over half of the effective rates that are of the average seen across the United States. Another thing, and you will see also the comparisons of other the comparator states as well. You can see that actually Denver, Colorado has the lowest rank and the lowest effective tax rate. For 2022, it was ranked 48. Its effective tax rate was 0.519. But at the same time, the tax bill amount in Colorado was $2,808, which was a rank of 30%, which was ranked 30th. One important point about Wyoming, while the effective tax rate for Wyoming is 0.645 in 2022, the tax bill amount is actually just $1,780, which is the lowest among the 8 states being compared on this sheet. This particular study, it also is comparing homestead property taxes for selected rural municipalities as well. And it selected those based on, it tried to find rural locations which had populations from 500 to 2,000 people, but were also a county seat, just to provide additional information to shed some light not only on the largest city in each state, but also on the rural communities as well. And you will see Wyoming's effective tax rate for the rural municipality they chose. They chose Worland, Wyoming, the effective tax rate being 0.709%. And the tax bill amount of $1,153. Wyoming has a rank of 37 on the effective rate and 34 on the tax bill amount, which is still among the lower ranks within these 8 states. It's the 5th lowest in this particular listing. The tax bill amount is the 6th lowest. The only tax bills lower are in Walsenburg, Colorado, and St. Anthony, Idaho. So while Wyoming is not the lowest, it is still among the lowest. One important point I wanted to make about this study, though, is the assessment of residential property, how states assess residential property differently. One particular thing that Wyoming does, it assesses residential property at 9.5% of its market value, whether the property is owner occupied, whether it is a primary residence, or whether it is a second home or a vacation home, or whatever, where there are some states that actually choose to just, the comparisons included in this reflect the reduced assessments that states employ on owner-occupied property. For example, the state of Utah, their assessment rate on owner-occupied primary residences is 55%, which is compared to the Wyoming's 9.5%. However, in Utah, if it is not an primary residence, owner-occupied, the assessment rate is actually at 100%. So there is quite a differentiation in some states regarding whether it's owner-occupied or otherwise. I'll go on to page 2. Page 2 shows the comparisons of property taxes among commercial properties. And this is something that Director Henson has alluded to in past meetings. Wyoming actually has, according to the study, has the lowest effective property tax rate and the lowest tax bill of all 53 of the largest cities in the comparison. So Wyoming, I believe, can say it does have among the very lowest effective tax rates for commercial property. You will notice that Worland, Wyoming's, the effective property tax rate is 0.658. Among the rural municipalities, that is ranked 49th, which again, amongst these comparisons, Wyoming is showing definitely that is not only the lowest among the 8 states being compared here, but also across the country as well. Now going on to the comparison of industrial property taxes. The discussion this morning from Administrator Ken Giel, he talked about personal property taxes, and part of his discussion was that personal property taxes are assessed very differently in the states. The way personal property is taxed or is considered exempt, there's a wide variety of that. So, and because of that different treatment of personal property and the valuation of industrial properties, this particular study provided 2 different comparisons. The one at the top is where personal property is equal to 50% of the total parcel value being assessed. And the bottom comparison is for industrial properties where personal property is equal to 60% of the total parcel value. So a higher level of personal property being assessed. They say that that particular comparison lends itself more to the estimates with personal property equal to 60% of the total parcel value is a better estimate for industries with a higher percentage of personal property. And I believe Wyoming really fits into that particular category. I believe the information that Mr. Giel shared, or Administrator Giel shared earlier today, described how personal property made up, as far as my calculations of that data, it was in excess of 80%. So personal property is certainly a significant portion of the taxation of industrial property in the state of Wyoming. One thing in looking at these comparisons that you can tell, in the comparison of homestead of the residential property, Colorado was ranked closest to the lowest effective tax rate for residential personal property. But actually, if you're looking at the comparisons of Colorado as far as commercial property and industrial property, theirs is considerably higher. There are states that definitely choose to assess their different property classes at a different assessment rates, resulting in a higher or a lower tax burden on those particular classes of property. Page 4, as this one is showing, for Cheyenne, Wyoming, Cheyenne has an effective tax rate of 0.76%. For actually all 3 categories, whether land and building value is 100,000, $1 million, or 25 million. Trying to find, let's see, I believe the average for industrial property nationwide, that average was 1.346%. So Wyoming is just over half. Wyoming's effective tax rate is just over half the national average, and again ranks favorably among the comparisons of the surrounding states as well. It certainly indicates it is not the lowest. In this particular comparison, this is showing Colorado is actually ranking the highest. And as far as the when personal property is 50% of the total parcel value, Idaho is actually ranked the lowest with an effective tax rate of just under 0.4%. And in looking at the comparisons where personal property is equal to 60% of the parcel value, Wyoming is about in the middle of the pack, if you will. They are the fourth highest at an effective tax rate of 0.707%. The reason that Wyoming's industrial tax rates look a little bit higher, as you know, is that industrial property is assessed at 11.5% rather than the 9.5%. So that will have an increase in impact on the effective tax rate of that particular property. But as this shows, Wyoming certainly ranks, it's not the highest, it is certainly not it is not the lowest, but it's certainly not the highest either among both the comparisons among the 50 states and of the 8 states in this comparison. Just going to and then page 5 is actually the same comparison, but only for the rural municipalities. You can see in Walsenburg, Colorado, that has an effective tax rate of almost 2.1%, which is actually fourth highest in the country and certainly the highest among the 8 states, where the comparison of Worland, the effective tax rate is just over 0.7%, which ranks 43rd among the 53 among the 50 cities, and the second lowest in this particular 8-state comparison. And I know this is a lot of numbers to get thrown at you and a lot to digest. As far as takeaways go, as I had mentioned, in looking at this study over quite a few years, went back as far as 2016. That was a particular time where Wyoming's effective tax rates ranked even lower than the 2022 study. And while the rates have increased somewhat, they are still well below the national average and even very competitive among Wyoming's surrounding states. I don't know if anyone has any questions or anything like that in response to this presentation.
I see some hands down here. Representative Locke, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for you on some of these numbers. So I might have missed this, and you might have said this, so I'll apologize up front if you did. So for some of these numbers, when you talk about the effective rate, it's simply as it relates to these home values and the taxable rate. But does this study take into consideration median household income or those other types of factors and how it impacts the taxpayer? I was just curious if the study goes that deep and evaluates it at that level. Thank you.
Mr. Timty?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Locke, I don't really remember seeing any discussion in that study particular to that. I will go ahead and, once I'm offline, I will look through the study again, and if I find anything, I will certainly pass that on to you.
Good. Any more questions for Mr. Timty before we let him go? Thank you, sir. Appreciate you. Committee will have a pop quiz on all these numbers here. All right, who's next? Taylor DuPont, good to see you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Taylor DuPont with LSO Budget Fiscal. I'll be going over the LSO memo titled $1 million exemption to all non-mineral property. So we were asked to see what would happen if there was a $1 million exemption applied to all the different classes of non-mineral property. That table 1 in the middle of the first page of the memo breaks down the resulting tax relief, which is equivalent to the fiscal impact of that policy. For the final answer, if you look at the right-hand side of the top row, we estimate around $624.7 million would be the total tax relief and fiscal impact of that policy. And almost 80% of that, or 492.7, would be going to residential property taxpayers. Table 2 on the next page describes that same number on a few other levels of total exemption, 250,000, 400,000, and 500,000, and breaks out the tax relief and impact from residential property in its own column, and also provides our estimate of the total number of accounts that would pay zero tax under this particular policy. So I'm happy to address any questions any of the members may have about this.
All right, committee, did you catch all that, or? We good?
Okay, so
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chairman, yes, sir.
my mind is trying to stay with you on this. Okay, just back to table 1. So if you granted every agriculture property an exemption, that's in that top shaded line, it would be 25 million. That's the sum of, is that the sum of all those other 3 below it? Or is that, what's it? Agriculture is 25 million, to grant $1 million exemption. So then below that, you have total estimated tax relief, fiscal impact. School foundation 12, the 31, the other local taxing. So that 25.9, is that a sum of those other 3? Okay, that's what I just wanted to.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Harshman, that's correct.
Okay, and so residential property, the cost is 492 million. That's, to do that for just residential. Commercial would be 84 million, industrial 21 million, and state assessed 1.1. So that grand total, to give all those accounts, be 624 million.
Chairman Biden, that's correct.
Okay, very good. And then flipping over to page 2, this is an example if you, different levels of exemption. So if you wanted to grant residential property tax exemptions of 250,000, it would cost 320 million. Is that right? Okay. And that would exempt 58% of the residences from paying property tax in Wyoming with a $250,000 exemption. Okay, and then all the other tax impact to all non-mineral property. That's commercial and ag.
Chairman Biden, Co-Chairman Harshman, and inclusive of residential property as well.
Oh, okay, inclusive of that as well. So it's a 320 plus another 70 million. Okay, good, okay. And that's 63%. So you can see these other 400,000 would take up 81%, but it costs 400 million. 500,000 would cost 433 million, takes up 87%. And then the old million is 492, take up 96% of the households in the state. Okay, I think I got it. I just wanted to say it out loud and see if the way I was saying it was actually right. So thank you, appreciate it.
All right. Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. DuPont. Any public comment? We are on item number 5, Wyoming property tax demographics. Yes, sir, Mr. Obermueller. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate this conversation, and I'm prompted to come up, Mr. Chairman, just to ask the committee to keep a holistic view in mind when talking about these various property tax and effective tax rates for the various industrial categories in particular. Industrial, of course, is mostly mineral. It's a lot of oil and gas, of course, coal and trona and those as well, but industrial is mostly mineral. So when you break them out into their individual categories, as Mr. Tempe did quite well, and you focus on the effective tax rate of each particular part of our tax code, it looks small in comparison to places like Colorado. But all I wanted to ask the committee to do, and particularly with respect to our previous conversation, is to keep in mind a more holistic view of our entire tax system, not only for minerals, but for everyone. So the effective tax rate, when you include everything together for minerals in Wyoming, is 10.1%. That is about triple the effective tax rate in New Mexico and double the effective tax rate of Colorado. It is the highest effective tax rate on minerals for all oil and gas producing states in the United States. I'm simply asking you to not be lulled by the fact that in one graph where you pull out one part, it looks like the effective tax rate is small, when in fact our overall rate is very, very large in Wyoming. I felt compelled to make sure the committee understood that.
Thank you, Mr. Obermuller. Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you're saying, obviously, the overall is, as we just heard, effectively low for the state over and over and over in every category. And you're saying that doesn't apply to minerals. So if you're doing the average, if minerals are paying extremely high and yet we come across low, that means we have extremely low. Wouldn't this follow in like the other categories? So no income tax, no corporate tax, lower sales tax, lower property tax. I mean, is that what you'd say as far as an average, if you exclude the mineral industry, which is why the mineral's high, but our average still ends up low, that basically everybody else is because the effective rate is low? Is that, I mean, do you think that's an accurate analysis?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Oakley, I think I follow where you're going, and that is directionally where I'm heading. I think it's pretty illustrative when you look at the graphs that Director Henson provided, particularly that graph on how much money is spent. That was just for the property tax side of it, but I think it illustrates your point. I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. We essentially ask minerals and then the collective residential homeowners in Wyoming to pay for everything. Nobody else is really asked to pay for anything. So, a tiny amount, 1%, 6%, but I keep in mind that industrial side accrues to minerals for the most part. So, those highlighted lines didn't include things like the industrial side and then also like pipelines, things like that are non-production, but are of course integral to production. So, so I don't know if that's where you're heading. I mean, essentially, what I was talking about was on the mineral side, make sure that you have a holistic approach. I think what you're asking about is all these other small ones at a low rank, are true so far as they go on the non-mineral side, and that's correct. So, yeah, I guess I would just, am I capturing what you're trying to say, Representative Oakley?
Okay. Senator Hyde.
Mr. Obermuller, you mentioned that 10.1% total. Could you give us a breakdown of that? Where does that collectively come from? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Obermuller.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, give me 30 seconds here. So the comparator is the production tax, which of course is the severance tax, and then property taxes, income taxes, of which ours is 0, but that's included for all the other states, and a sales and use tax. So it's a total state and local taxes, federal taxes not included. So when you compare us to, say, Texas, which is at an 8% effective tax rate, and we're at 10.1, add into our mix the federal, and then we're much further above Texas than just 2.1%. Does that answer your question, Senator Hyde?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermuller, yeah, that does. So basically, you got production tax, which is the severance tax. And then the property tax would be the ad valorem effectively, right?
Mr. Chairman, yes, and I believe what's included in here is it's all property taxes, so your real and your personal property
Okay,
tax.
okay. And then sales and use tax.
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, co-chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Obermiller, and so just those three things, not royalties and rents, whether it's private or public minerals, just those three
It's
taxes.
the comparative of taxes, not federal taxes and not any sort of private or state land related.
So no private FM or FMRs or state royalties.
Nope.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else? No? Thank you. Oh,
Mr. Chairman?
yes.
I'll just say it again, I think, too, for folks. I always say it this way, in some, minerals pay half our taxes. I mean, they pay half taxes, and legacy minerals pay about 30%. I mean, our investments in the permanent trust fund now, about 30% of our bills are paid. And so you're looking at those two, it's over 80% are minerals and legacy minerals. And I think the other thing that sticks in my head, you know, we had some talk about savings earlier, but we spend about 85% of the mineral taxes every year on today's people. We only save about 15% of that. And as I've worked that through with our staff, you know, but sometimes we, you know, you think of the 6% severance, you know, and we've upped that savings in recent years, but it's pretty incredible, really. And I know it's a competitive thing, but it's really changed Wyoming forever, certainly. I mean, that other 30% is, you know, gift from Governor Hathaway and other legislators in our minerals industry over all these decades. And then the other little nugget of kind of trivia, Wyoming just became the #1 per capita this past year in investment income per capita, past Alaska. And it's really been a complete guarantee against ever having an income tax in this state. And, but we're always going to be, you know, looking at this, and we appreciate you bringing it. You know, there was a time when severance was 13% on coal, you know, and then 8%, and now we're at 6.5%. So we'll continue to work this, and so our industry stays strong. But we're certainly appreciative in Wyoming, what minerals has done, and oil and gas, it's been huge. So, okay, but thank you for bringing that to us. We'll continue to work on it, look at it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I just, thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. So I guess the reason why I got up here, and it's not just to hear myself talk, though you might accuse me otherwise, but as you're considering policy changes, I know there are some of you who want to see that spending pie just shrink entirely, that we just spend less. And that's fine, that's policy choice, of course, but the most of the proposals about how to do that are related to the percentages of revenue in Wyoming that just the smaller slices. So you may end up spending less, but more of what we spend will be required from my members. And then on the flip side, there's some of you who are interested in broadening the base, whatever, totally reforming our tax code. And again, I just caution you to take a look at how that works holistically when you try to do that, because then again, maybe the pie stays the same, or the goal, I think, the policy goal is to have the pie stay the same, but essentially it asks that restructuring to benefit the small slices while we stay the same or grow, my members stay the same or grow. So that's, it's a tough call. It's a tough call, but Mr. Chairman, I'm done. Thank you.
Right on, don't be that third monkey. That was the quote of the day, Mr. Deti. Probably the year so far. All right, anything else for Mr. Obermiller before we let him go? Seeing none. Okay, committee, do you need a break or do you want to keep trucking?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
we do have somebody
Oh, we still
online
have
who
public
would like to
comment.
give public comment.
Oh, let's bring him in. What's that? And we need more public comment? Okay.
Thank you,
So we'll do the room first, and then we'll go to Zoom. So hang tight on Zoom. Okay. Mr. Meyer? Welcome back,
Pat
sir.
Meyer, Park County Assessor, talking on behalf of Park County. Just wanted to go over a few things during the good director's presentation. First, homesteads. It was a bad law when we passed it. Let me explain. Park County for, well over 40 years allocated 2 acres farmstead to all farms in general, unless you had houses after houses on your farmstead. Then you got more acres. When this law was in effect, so it went basically to 1 acre, and all your outbuildings that had to have farm equipment in. You couldn't have antique cars or your boats or RVs in there. Had to do that. But then say you do have, that's what you had. Well, then you go by, if you have more grazing land than irrigated land, you get that for $75 an acre. That's good $5. If you've got more irrigated land, you get the $2,300 an acre. And what it did was cause inequities all over the counties, because you got people right next to each other. One's got more grazing land, and then the other one who had irrigated land, and they're paying more. And then you have farmers who lease out, and they're not even getting ag rates, but they're paying full price for their stuff. And I just thought, if you guys ever want to rehash into that, and it's not like I'm looking for the money, I was looking for the equity. In fact, I sent a letter out to all 750 farmers saying, if you want us to come out and see your farm equipment and your buildings, we'll be happy to review your entire property. And I didn't get one farmer who wanted us to come out on their property, and they don't like us looking at inside their buildings for any reason. So nobody ever came. Now, I was forced to do this because it was a law, and the state board says, hey, it's a law, Pat, you got to follow it. So I conceded. If you at least gave me a property equipment list, I only gave you 1 acre. If you didn't give me any equipment list, you weren't getting that. You were going to go with the 2 acres like I've always had it. Anyways, it's just something you might want to rehash or bring that back. The Camas system, as the director said, it is great for getting reports statewide. Other than that, it really has little to do with uniformity. I mean, even in the beginning, if you're in a different county, your cost multipliers are different being in Cody than they are in Natrona County. And it's really, you strive for uniformity in your own county. You can't worry about how the other counties are doing it. And that's what it is. But I do appreciate that, because I've done a lot of presentations and got to use all the state's property, which if we were all not on the same system, you'd have to call everybody up and get that stuff to get these kind of results for you. The other thing is the colleges. The colleges, I'd love to see that. I've never cared, just because you got a college in your county, nobody else has to pay when all these people are coming from all over the state to your college. And other states even, but especially there. I mean, it's not, I don't think that's a fair deal. When you got in there, we're paying 5 mils, and the surrounding counties don't have to pay anything because the college is right there and they're using it. Might be something you might want a conversation about in the future as well. And as far as the mill levies, as the director said, well, I'd love to see who's not at their max in this state, because I've never seen our hospital districts not take the 3 mills. I've never seen fire districts not take the 3 mills. Conservation districts always take 1 mill because that's as much as they can get. We didn't pass, never, always take their 1 mill, you know? So, but anyways, that again is why we're on a fixed rate system, you know, and they all have their own boards. You really can't stop them. If the board passes the budget, you know, the only thing you can hope for is they didn't ask for as much, but they make sure they get as much as they can. That's how it's been. So I just thought I'd point that out. With that, I'll take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Any questions? Any questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Welcome back to Revenue. Please introduce yourself for the record.
Thank you. My name is Rosemary Saban, Natrona County resident. I apologize because I dropped my phone at lunch and it's now broken. I list some of the things that I heard in that testimony. Looking at a bill for greater property tax relief is what Ms. Henson was recommending, if I'm correct. I fail to understand why our government takes our money to invest our money, to dole our money back out to us. $20 million this year, $3 million last year, 1.1 was expended. I don't think the residents need to have the government taking our money to give it back to us. It creates a better community and a better economy if you leave the money in the people's pockets and let them spend it as they choose. So looking for more relief, I think we need to look at cutting that excessive amount because, to be frank, when I went to school, that was called theft. These schools, we're providing schools. There's a prime example right behind y'all. They tore down houses, they expanded for a parking lot and some parking lot and the aquatic center over there. And we're paying for a lot of heating and cooling, and that's not an education. We're providing in Natrona County, and I don't know about the rest of the state, but in Natrona County, we're paying for buses because the free choice. If you want to take your kid to another school, be my guest. But why do the taxpayers have to fund that? That it doesn't make any sense to me. I think there's a lot that could be cut out of the budget. And this comparison that I saw of other states, that we have the lowest property taxes in Wyoming. Why are we comparing ourselves to other states? Does it matter? Is that justification? Is the logic that we'll let the cow out of the barn and then try to get her back in? Because I don't know about y'all, but I don't like to run and chase a cow. There's the special districts. That was another topic here. Okay, so Mr. Pat Sweeney so kindly just came into the commissioner's office, and through a resolution, we're now going to see on the ballot in Natrona County here a special district for the senior center. Seniors are funded federally, and there's other grant opportunities. So providing that 1 mil, this is where I lost my phone, but I think 1 mil in Natrona County generates $1.6 million. Is 1 mil required for that special district? And then by state statute that's included with that resolution, through a request only, they can receive 2. So that doubles the budget. And then increases our property taxes. The people have screamed loudly that we want property tax relief, and then there's all this stuff coming at us to increase it. So I guess that's all I'd like to say on behalf of the people. And any questions?
Get my mic to work. Okay, any questions for Ms. Saban? Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you kindly.
Thanks. Okay, I think we're done with the room now. Eve, we got a Zoomer still.
Yeah, we have Brett Glass.
All right, Mr. Glass, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and give us your comments, please.
Thank you. My name is Brett Glass. I am in Laramie, Wyoming, and I do two things here primarily. The first is that I run an internet provider, and so I run a technology business, and I am also a landlord. My family owns some rental properties, and I mainly want to talk about today's demographic information, which I found really interesting with respect to the latter business, with respect to renters. Although it relates to my technology business as well. My technology business is always looking for young workers to help do what we do, which is we provide internet, and so we need people to go out and install internet for the customers so that they can be connected. And well, we have trouble finding them. And the reason is, unfortunately, that we have a brain drain. And even though we're right here where the University of Wyoming is, a lot of people leave the state immediately after they graduate. And one of the reasons is, well, so is sort of reflected in the chart which our good director of revenue showed you in, and I'll I'm trying to see if I can get my camera to do this despite the green screen. There we go. What it shows is that there is a big, that we are way behind the rest of the country in the age group from 25 to 35. And that represents the group, the brain drain of the University of Wyoming students who are leaving. Why are they leaving? Well, one reason is that unfortunately they don't feel that the conditions here are conducive to them building a career and hopefully buying a house. They're initially renting. We have, as you saw from some of the slides earlier, the largest percentage of renters in the state. And we're not the only ones. Other communities such as Cheyenne and Gillette and Jackson also have a lot more renters percentage-wise than the rest of the state. These are our workforce. We need them for economic development and diversification. And yet all of the property tax relief that we have granted during the last legislative session omitted renters in every possible way. The exemptions don't apply if you rent, and they also don't apply to the landlord if the landlord rents any part of their property. I rent, among other things, I rent out the basement of my home. This disqualifies me for practically all of the exemptions that were passed during the 2024 session. If I had an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit on my property, maybe to make a little extra income or to house somebody who worked for me, again, I lose the exemptions because the exemptions are only for single family residences. If something isn't owner occupied, for example, our family owns an apartment building. Again, we don't have any exemption from, any relief from property tax. Now, some of the bills, have problems with mixed use properties. That the apartment building that my family owns is part commercial and part residential. Well, I talked to the assessor about that, and the assessor says we can't really apply the exemptions to that either. And so I, as a landlord, can't pass those breaks on to the tenants. We have to at least break even on the properties, and so we have to charge higher rents, and the tenants are driven out by the higher rents, and they start to look at moving to places like Denver. So this is a serious problem. So anyway, what I want you to bear in mind, since you're considering various balances between sales taxes and property taxes and different kinds of longer term property tax relief and just what you passed during this session, my plea is please make it fair and uniform, and don't exclude especially that important class of people, the people who are renting and haven't yet bought. The Wyoming Constitution has sort of a general requirement that taxation be equitable and uniform. So please try to conform to that. And please try to start from first principles rather than creating a labyrinth of special exemptions and overlapping special cases. As we did in this year, there are 3 or 4 credits and exemptions that overlap in different ways. And even our local assessor isn't sure which ones will apply to how many people and which ones overlap and which ones exclude one another. So in closing, let's try to sort all this out and try to make Wyoming a desirable state to live in that's not hostile to new residents, that's not hostile to new businesses, and isn't hostile to the workforce that we need in order to diversify our economy and to develop it farther. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Glass. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you, sir. Appreciate your comments today. Thanks for joining us. All right. Eve, is that it? That's it for Zoom. Last chance for the room. Seeing none. Okay, committee, we probably have some full bladders. Let's take a 10-minute break. Come back with the last item up for business with item number 6, grappling with a new property tax revolt will be right after the break. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. All right, let's call it back to order here. Go ahead and take your seats. Give you guys a couple seconds here to get situated. We'll introduce Jared Walzak from the Tax Foundation. Sir, thanks for coming out to Wyoming and giving us this presentation. I'll turn the floor over to you, sir, if you want to give us a quick introduction and then get on with your presentation.
Chair Bidman, members of the commission, it is a privilege to be here with you today. I am Jared Walzak, Vice President of State Projects at the Tax Foundation. I've had the opportunity to testify before this commission on a number of topics a few times, and one thing I appreciate, I get to go to different parts of your great state when I do that. So I've been here, I've been in Cheyenne, I've been in Pinedale, which is all the civilization you need, which I was delighted to learn, and I think I agree with. But I have not spoken with you before on property taxes, so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about that today because it's a pressing issue, not just here, but regionally and to some extent nationally. I have titled this presentation Grappling with the New Property Tax Revolt, new being an important operative word here because this is not the first time that this country has seen the sort of convulsions we are right now around property taxes. The first would be in the late 1970s, and we're repeating some of the processes, some of the considerations that we saw then. So I want to talk about what happened then a little bit, what's happening now, the whys, the wherefores, and what the appropriate approaches are. Firstly, I think we just need to acknowledge that there are some very, I'll get to this, very legitimate reasons why this is an issue. Wherever you land on what we should do, everyone can recognize that we are in a fairly unique situation where property valuations are rising dramatically. Now they're leveling off a bit, but I'll show some numbers later. But just to put this in context, using the Case-Shiller property valuations, that index, over about a little over 3 years, property values nationwide rose about 46%. That's the existing property stock, 46%. And of course, many jurisdictions around the country have provisions in place to try to adjust the millages, to adjust the property tax rates so that you don't get all of that additional value into the tax. And even where that's not the case, local jurisdictions can, of course, make the choice. You have elected officials who can make these choices, say, no, we are going to adjust these millages downward. We are not going to collect this. But not every jurisdiction does that to the same degree, and not every state has the same mechanisms to do that. Now, if you're a property owner who has 46% more value on paper in your home, and your millage has not adjusted at all, you probably don't feel like you're getting 46% better or more government, or that you really wanted it, and something feels really, really wrong. There's also an issue that even if your millages are declining substantially, this is confusing. You get your assessment, you see that it's risen dramatically, and maybe later you will find out that your millages dropped. Maybe you won't realize that they've dropped. There's both a real issue, there's also a perception issue. Sometimes they run in parallel, sometimes they do not. But either way, we have a lot of discontent. We have a lot of people looking at property taxes and saying, I don't know if I can afford these sort of increases. I want government to do something about this. It's not my fault that my property values have risen this dramatically. Nothing has changed in the real world for me. And where that is happening, there's of course a turn to state officials. And you know this, and all the presentations thus far have talked about this. Property taxes are local, or at least primarily local. And yet the solutions are often asked to be at the state level, and that creates challenges, it creates problems. There are solutions at hand for you, but it does make it more challenging to get it right when you're trying to set essentially local policy at the state level. Now, property taxes are important. And this is something that I really want to hammer home, not just here, but everywhere, because this is becoming a huge issue across the country where increasingly we have people saying, do we really need the property tax at all? Is this an appropriate tax anymore? And it's of course one of the oldest taxes we have. I don't just mean in the United States, but Around the world, historically, the property tax is one of the oldest taxes that we have. It is a tax that has existed in every state and every territory of the United States at pretty much every time. I think the only example you could find of a place under the governance of the United States where there hasn't been a property taxes is a few largely unoccupied census districts in Alaska. Basically, if people live there, there's a property tax. There's a real property tax on real property. And now we're having conversations in a number of states, 6 by my count, where there's some interest in eliminating most or maybe even all of the property tax on residential real property. That's new. So let's talk about why we have this and what the benefits of the property tax are. Firstly, there's the transparency of it. And this is a double-edged sword, as you probably have all realized and experienced. From the perspective of the public finance world, from the perspective of economists, you want all taxes to be as transparent as possible. People should know what they're paying. They should be able to make decisions that on the margin take this into account. Transparency is a good thing. It's a good governance thing. The problem, of course, is the property tax is transparent, your other taxes are not. If I asked people here, if I asked people listening online what they paid in property taxes last year, there's a pretty good chance many people could tell me what they paid. If I asked you what you paid in sales taxes last year, I don't think anyone has a clue. I don't have a clue. I mean, I've done the rough math to try to say, like, there's calculators out there. You can use them and get a general sense of what the average person would pay, but you don't know what you paid in sales tax last year as an individual. So herein lies a major problem. The transparent tax is the one that feels very onerous. It's not just that you know the amount, but you pay it once, or in some cases twice, or a few times a year. You pay it in big chunks. Maybe it's coming out of escrow, maybe it's a check you're writing, but you feel that in a way that you don't feel other taxes. Again, this is a good thing on the whole. You should have transparency in taxes, but when one tax is highly transparent, it becomes very salient. And when the other taxes aren't, they can fade away. We don't think about those. A good thing about the property tax is it's relatively neutral, and this applies to real property taxes. It does not apply to tangible property taxes on that different class of personal property. So you've heard some discussions, I believe, earlier today about tangible personal property. That is not a particularly neutral tax. That's a tax on capital accumulation. It's a tax on investment. These are things that can be moved. This is not neutral, but the real property tax is about as neutral as you can hope to get within the realm of taxation. All taxes, to some degree, have an economic effect. Whatever you tax, you get less of. The great thing about land is it's really hard to have less of it. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't change some of its use cases, but the fact that it is a fixed location, geographically bound asset, and the fact that you have relatively low elasticities of demand for it, means that you are going to get a lot less economic decision-making based on the property tax and its rates. And that's what you want. You do not want taxes to be changing behavior any more than is necessary. Every time you do that, you create distortions. You create some situations where some investments are good and some are bad, not because the market says so, but because the tax code says so. And every time that happens, you're getting into second and third best solutions, not the best. If you want dynamism, if you want the market to function properly, you want as neutral of a tax system as possible. And the property tax is among the most neutral out there.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Representative Walczak, I'm just struggling a bit. When you say neutral, you're not talking regressive or progressive. Give me a couple synonyms, because neutral's not, I'm not getting it.
Thank you. Through the chair to Representative Monitor, that is an excellent question. By neutrality, I am referring to the degree to which it impacts economic decision-making, not the degree, not the way that it applies. So progressivity and regressivity are very important issues as well, and we will discuss some of those too. But this is not about the incidence of the burden. It is about how it influences decisions made in the economy. And the property tax It does it. Every tax does it, but this does it less than most. Property taxes, when they're well designed, and that's an important qualifier, also conform largely to what's called the benefit principle. And not a lot of taxes do this. The idea here is that when you have local real property taxes, you're paying roughly in proportion to the benefit that you receive. There's a number of reasons for this. One, just the nature of local taxation, that it is funding things that are less transfer-based. The more welfare-oriented elements of government are going to be the state and the federal level. Local governments do some distribution and some transfer, of course, but much more of it goes to some of the public goods, or at least quasi-public goods, that are benefiting all people. A lot of it's also going towards things that actually increase in value to you on the basis of your property. Imagine for a moment that you were trying to privately provide for some of the services you get for local government. And I'm not asking us to go into some libertarian world where we're in some anarchy and governments don't provide this, but I'm saying as a thought experiment, what if you had to contract for having a road by your house? What if you had to contract for fire, police, EMS, all of those things? What if you had to basically do this through insurance contracts? Now think about your insurance contracts that you do have. They align with the value of your property. The more valuable your property is, the more valuable that insurance is, the more benefit you're receiving. And people will say, well, okay, schools, not so sure about that one. What if I don't have kids? Am I getting value? Or my property being more valuable, am I getting more value out of this? But of course, take a look at the value of residential property and how much the school district plays into it. It actually does have a very direct bearing on the value of your property, the value of the education that's provided there. Now, are any of these things perfect? No, of course not. But they much more closely conform to this principle than most of the other taxes you could impose. So again, public finance scholars tend to like these, especially that self-reinforcing aspect with like schools and roads and other things where it actually increases the value of the property. It makes its utilization better. All of these things are good. One of the things that, of course, people raise with the property tax is do I essentially own my property if I'm always paying property taxes on it? And at one level, that's a really interesting philosophical question. And I don't know if I have a perfect answer other than to say that I'm not sure that we get any further with almost any other tax. Do I own my labor if I pay an income tax? Do I own my existing capital if I pay a sales tax or an excise tax? We can get into all of these questions. I would simply submit to you that the property tax is not radically different. You are gaining benefit for the services provided to your property. You are living in a community where these services are provided. You're paying them on that basis. You could pay them on other bases. In fact, you do pay them on other bases as well. But there's not really, to my thinking, much of a philosophical or theoretical distinction on, do I own this if I'm paying property taxes? Do I own my labor? Do I own my property? Do I own my activity? Everything we do, if there's a tax on it, to some degree it is constrained. That is the nature of accepting that we live in a system that requires taxation. And I understand that sort of implicit, am I renting from the government? No, you're not renting from the government. And this is a system that, like I said, has existed from founding this country, really the founding of just about every political and economic order that we can look at. I understand some of the resistance to it, but the property tax has a very real place, and it has significant value compared to other taxes that are going to do more to change economic decision-making. The closest tax you can come to with that neutrality principle is going to be a properly constructed consumption tax. They also can be fairly economically neutral. The problem is that your sales tax, or really anyone's sales tax, is further divergent from an ideal consumption tax than your residential property tax is divergent from an appropriate property tax. In fact, in Wyoming, this is particularly the case where the sales tax is overwhelmingly, compared to a lot of states, falling on business inputs. It's falling on those intermediate transactions. So it's becoming more of a production tax. It is changing decision-making about the cost of acquiring capital, the cost of replacing, of utilizing, the cost of doing business here versus doing business elsewhere. A properly constructed consumption tax doesn't do a lot of these things. It'd be very neutral too. You don't have that. Now, no tax is ever pure in its perfectly ideal form because Government can't operate that way. That's not how the real world works. But the real property tax here is much closer to it, and it has significant value. Now, you all know that you have a very unusual mix of property taxes, and this has been discussed at length today, and you all know this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But what's important to note here is that when you're doing state-by-state comparisons of property taxes, it can get a little misleading if you're not careful, because residential is about 28% most recently of your property tax collections. That's not insignificant, but it's also nowhere near what you would see in most other states, because of course the mineral estate is enormous here. And so that mineral property tax is huge. And even that commercial industrial has some mineral elements in there. So you have industry paying an awful lot of the property tax. Now, we had public comment right before I got up that mentioned also the rental side of this. And I just do want to briefly mention that commercial property tax is going to apply, commercial assessment, that classification is going to apply wherever you have 4 or more units. So any sort of relief that you are providing that is just to homeowners is not going to handle any renters. And anything that you do that's just for residential property rather than commercial property is not going to benefit renters who are in these larger 4 or more unit facilities. Now, Wyoming doesn't have a ton of renters compared to most states. That said, renters are still people who need housing, and renters often are lower income than those who own their own home. And a lot of the relief that many states, including Wyoming, have offered targets people who maybe are at the lower and the middle range of property owners, but it can be regressive in the sense that you're skipping the people who are even lower than the property owners, the people who may be renting. And only 14% of revenue came from residential properties. In the most recent year, we can get to that number. So some trends. Property taxes make up 72% of local tax revenue nationwide. Nationally, housing values, according to the 2022 census data, a little behind, are up 33.6%. But like I said, I'm using a 46% number from the Case-Shiller Index because that gets us up a lot closer to here. But even just using what we can go through on census, which is over a year and a half behind at this point, people were paying 14.3% more. But in real terms, property tax collections nationwide were down 5.5%. How can this be? Inflation. Now, inflation is a huge, huge issue, but it's not an issue of Wyoming's creation, and it's not a problem for Wyoming's property tax to solve. People are paying more in nominal terms in property taxes across the country. But in many cases, the government is collecting less because of inflation. So that is a first order thing to consider, that even when you're seeing these claims that, okay, the millages have not rolled back enough for this to seem flat, you really do have to inflation adjust because government's costs have risen as well. And of course, thankfully, people's wages and salaries have risen along with inflation. In fact, wages have risen faster than inflation. Now, that's not an excuse for inflation. Inflation is a real problem. And we know, of course, that not everyone's wages rise, that, wages are sticky, prices are sticky. There are a lot of inflection points where maybe you were able to get a salary increase, maybe you weren't. So inflation's harming a lot of people. But when we look at where property tax collections are on residential property, we actually see them declining, not rising nationwide. Nonetheless, we have seen a lot of desire for property tax constraints of some sort, because if you haven't had that relief, if your local government hasn't reduced millages in some way, you're facing some really high property tax increases that legitimately do not make sense and are not fair. So, property owners come to all of you and say, we would like to fix this. And there are only so many ways you can do this. You can do rate limits, you can do levy limits, you can do assessment limits. Those 3 are the most significant. Rate limits are what it says on the box, limiting either how much the rate can rise or putting absolute caps on what the rates can be. And when you have multiple different entities that can tax, as you do, that can be either an aggregate cap or it can be caps on the millages for each individual taxing authority. Levy limits are revenue limits. These are restricting the amount of revenue growth that can be generated year to year based on the value of existing property. if new people move in and they build new construction, that should be outside of that cap, and it almost always is. But if existing property has just raised in value a lot and you're raising a lot more revenue from it, a levy limit is saying, okay, let's have a growth factor. We can allow maybe inflation plus whatever additional increment the legislature chooses to set. But after that, it rolls back the millages so that there isn't an automatic tax increase beyond that. The advantage of this is that it is county-wide. Some states do it statewide. That doesn't make a lot of sense because you have radical variations from county to county, and what matters is the revenue within an individual jurisdiction or taxing authority. But the advantage here is it's still keeping market valuations as the basis. This is where assessment limits, and you've adopted some new assessment limits this past session, they can go wrong. And I know that this is already done, but I still want to spend a little time warning about what this can mean, because you will almost certainly be asked in future years to make changes to this, because every state that's adopted assessment limits has modified them quite a few times. So I don't want to consider this a done deal. I want to talk about what this does. Because assessment limits are a constraint based on the individual property. It limits for tax purposes at least, the amount that the assessed value can rise from year to year. This means that short of a precipitating event, like the sale of property, your incumbency in a property is more of a determinant over time in how much you pay than the actual value of your property. This means that there's a lock-in effect, that if you have been in your home a long time, you're paying very little, so you really don't want to sell and you don't want to move. And it means that you have this generational shift and this time shift. Someone who's buying their first house, say 10 years from now, is going to have to bear the brunt of a much higher effective property tax rate, because they're going to pay the full real rate, which is going to have to be higher than it would be otherwise, because someone else or a lot of someone else's are receiving a much lower rate. You're going to discourage change of use of property. You're going to, on the margin, discourage even the expansion or the change of property. Now, you only assess at current market value the renovations. You don't, in your legislation, reassess everything when you do that. But when any sort of new construction, new changes would be at market rate, and you have a house that is years from now at a much, much lower effective rate, that's a disincentive to do so. This lock-in effect means that homeowners who might be empty nesters, who might be ready to downsize, aren't going to want to. It's going to mean that it's more costly to build new homes, because by definition, the owner is going to be someone paying full freight. It's going to mean that, if you're worried about brain drain, if you're worried about the new generation being here, that they're going to pay a whole lot more. Basically, it just radically distorts the property market in ways where the same home in two different places, like across the street, basically the same home, can pay radically different amounts. And I'm going to show you an example of that in just a few minutes. Other mechanisms, and you've looked at and even used some of these, are high homestead exemptions, tax rebates or swaps, where the state is basically stepping in and either directly giving something to residents, to homeowners, or giving something to local governments to help them abate. And then circuit breakers that are targeted at target populations, which you had some before, and you expanded those this year for, older residents, for, military, for a variety of different purposes. Let me show you California Proposition 13. When I say that the property tax revolt started in the late 1970s, it started in California in 1978 with Prop 13. It spread to a lot of states, but this was initially a pure assessment limit. They have modified it probably a dozen times since then. This is a simple example, but they used a base year of 1975. They adopted it in 78, but they said, what was your assessed value in 75? And then it can only increase by it was the lesser of 2% or California's inflation, unless you sold it. Then it would reassess to market rate. Now, they've also made a bunch of other changes since then. They've created portability. We'll talk about that in a second, where homeowners can take their reduced assessment rate and transfer it to another property they buy later. That does some good things. It reduces the lock-in effect, but it also does some really bad things that distort property values in markets in other ways. They've adopted a lot of adjustments to this, but this is simple. Let's say that you currently have a property that in market value terms is worth $1 million. And then I said, all right, let's see how much you're paying in property taxes based on when you acquired that property. If you bought it in 1975, you'd be paying in Los Angeles County $1,800 a year in property taxes. If you bought it last year, you'd be paying $16,400 in property taxes. Again, exact same property, $1 million in market value, but 9 times as much because of the effective assessment limits. And that's the concern. Now, yours isn't as aggressive, thankfully, as California's, but that's still sort of the tendency of these. And California had a really big lock-in effect problem, so they adopted portability. Florida did this too, where you can take your reduced assessment value and you can transfer it to another property, either in Florida to another in the same county or California statewide, and you can sort of transfer that. The benefit is that, okay, now you can actually say, let's downsize, or go to a larger place that we need and free up some cheaper housing for someone else. That makes sense. That's part of the dynamic in the market. That's making sure there's housing affordability and availability. The downside, of course, is that you are basically saying that the longer that you have owned a home, no matter which home it is, the less you pay. And that the people who probably have the greatest ability to afford a more expensive home and to afford property taxes may be paying next to nothing. And those who are just entering the market are bearing the much greater weight. It also creates a weird break with services, where I talk about this being a benefits type of tax. Well, if you're paying almost nothing, and you're going to pay almost nothing, you're going to pay a fraction of what others pay, regardless of what services are provided. You have a strong incentive to want a lot of services to be provided. You're paying a tiny amount. If you're paying a quarter of what your neighbor is, yeah, let's jack it all up and get a lot more services. Great deal for me. Of course, that may not be a great deal for someone who can afford it less, who's entering now, who has to do that, whether they want those or not. Now, different jurisdictions can and should experiment with different levels of services, different sizes of government, but the people paying for it need to be paying for it. And this distorts that quite dramatically. So this is a concern. This is something that you have adopted, again, not in the extreme way that California has, but states that have done this have seen significant distortions in their property taxes over time. They've seen it affect markets in some really peculiar ways. One thing that I'll mention here is the property taxes tend to be at least partially capitalized into the cost of a home. That is, if you have higher property taxes, the sales price of that home is lower. If you have low property taxes, the sales price is higher because it affects the sort of the future costs of ownership. And obviously this will depend on the elasticities. It depends on how hot or cold your property market is, how much demand there is, how much people need to live in a place. But there is partial capitalization of the property tax into a value of the home. When you put constraints on property taxes like this one, you are further shifting, even beyond the way we talked about, burdens to newer owners or future owners away from older ones, because the people who have already acquired property will now see the value of their properties rise even faster, because when they sell them, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Because there's going to be this funny mix where the property tax, if the property is purchased by someone who, say, the future has portability, or if the property stays with someone who's owned it for a long time, you have one set of values. If you have it bought by someone else, there's a different set of values. So when you brought in, when jurisdictions bring in a lot of these ways to try to address one problem, they bring in portability, they do something like this, they create this weird mix on capitalization where you invert its effects to some degree, and the newer homeowners are paying more and are paying more in property taxes. And the benefit largely accrues to the people who already own, who see the value of the property rise, who see the amount they pay in property taxes fall. So it creates some very perverse and weird incentives. Again, there's lock-in effect, this discouraging relocation and renovation, discouraging the change of use of property. All of these things are issues. Now, a lot of states right now are thinking about this, some of them much more than you. I would say that I would class these into sort of two categories. Florida, Texas, and a state that's not on this list, Pennsylvania, I would say there's interest, but it's sort of at a conceptual stage. It's generating some heat, but not necessarily, like they see anything significant happen. Nebraska, North Dakota, and here. This is a very, very live issue in slightly different ways. In Nebraska, you have what's called the EPIC initiative. It may or may not go on the ballot, but it would eliminate basically all of their current taxes and replace it with a supposedly broad-based sales tax. It's not that broad-based. Proponents say that it would take, that they could have a 7.5% rate on personal consumption, and with that, you could eliminate the individual income tax, the corporate income tax, the current sales tax, you replace it with this new consumption tax, the property tax, and the inheritance tax. If you could do that, I would be the biggest champion of this thing. That would be amazing, and it would be so pro-growth. Unfortunately, we calculate that the actual rate would have to be about 22%, and that makes a bit of a difference. They made a lot of mistakes in their calculations, a lot of mistakes. So you're probably not going to have a 22% sales tax rate here. Thankfully, that's not been on the table. I know that there was a serious consideration of a 2 percentage point increase in the sales tax to abate property taxes for a significant number of individuals. North Dakota, a citizen initiative to eliminate the residential property tax entirely, no pay-fors, just leave it up to the legislature to figure out how to do that. Now, they actually have really good surpluses right now. I don't know if they'll have them 5 years from now, 10 years from now. There's no actual pay for this. And there's also no mechanism in which the state is going to shift this to local governments. If this passed, I suppose the state officials would have to figure that out. But then, of course, you are having state government basically fully fund local government with all that entails. In Wyoming, the advantage is that this is all being considered here in the legislature, which I think gives a much more serious consideration of the issues than you have sometimes with the purely direct democracy proposals. It's one thing for citizens to say, let's just abolish the property tax and someone else figure it out. Legislators don't do that, can't do that. So you're having a much more serious discussion. But there's still a lot on the table. Obviously, there was that proposal went very, very far to seriously abate property taxes for most homeowners with a 2 percentage point increase in sales tax. There was the adoption of the 4% assessment limit. There were abatements, there were like circuit breakers for a lot of people. It is very popular, of course, to put circuit breakers in place for, say, senior citizens, and I get it. They may be on fixed incomes. You don't want to price them out of their home. No one wants that. But these things can be blunt instruments that don't make a whole lot of sense. They often benefit not only the fixed income homeowner who might have a very small property, but also the very wealthy retiree with a very large property. If you need a circuit breaker, and almost all states have circuit breakers, I would just encourage them to be more narrowly tailored. Low-income individuals with properties that are relatively affordable. It's not just your income. If you have property worth $2 million, even if your income stream is relatively low, you have a property worth $2 million. I mean, that's a choice. You could live somewhere else. I know it's a hard thing to say, but you could live somewhere else. Genuinely, most legislators are going to care very deeply about the person who is living on Social Security checks and owns a property, and no one wants them out of that. That's where circuit breakers can absolutely come into place. Do they create distortions? Yeah. They're not perfect. Any public finance scholar is going to cringe a little, but again, part of politics is making sure that we're providing for people, and we can accept some level of market distortion. We can accept some level of inefficiency, some level of non-neutrality to achieve some really important goals. The question is how much. And I think it's one thing to say, let's make sure that lower income homeowners can still afford to be in their house. It's another thing to say, no one should pay property taxes, or no one should ever see any significant property tax increase, or just by virtue of your age, that you should cease paying property taxes. Those are really significant things that create massive distortions and push the property tax burdens onto different classes of people and push the other tax burden onto other classes of people. This is, of course, a state that doesn't have an individual income tax, does not have a corporate income tax. You do have a lot of taxes on business. I think sometimes that's missed when you think, well, we don't have corporate income tax, but your sales tax taxes more business activity than the vast majority of other states' sales taxes. Your property tax is hitting an awful lot of business activity, especially, of course, in minerals. And that's not on the table for elimination, nor should it be. You have the severance tax, the production tax. You have a variety of other taxes that are falling on business activity. There is a limit to how much you want to shift everything to that. This isn't just a question of fairness, though maybe that's part of it. People say like, well, should businesses pay more? Should businesses pay less? But part of it is you want stability, you want certainty, you want economic growth. And if you shift all of your taxes to productive activity, all of it to capital accumulation, that's a bad thing for your economy. Even in a state that may look low tax overall, if you put all of your taxes into one category, it can be very high tax for certain activities that you probably do not want to discourage. Again, speaking of the neutrality, property taxes achieving that. Some of these other taxes are not. This is not a sales tax presentation. I know you get one of those tomorrow, but I do just want to talk very briefly about what it means when you're taxing business inputs. It's not just the businesses paying sales tax, because in some ways, that is passed on to someone, but it's a question of who that someone is. When the sales tax is on consumption, it actually doesn't really matter a lot what your rate is for business activity on an interstate basis, because sales taxes are destination sourced. The person, business or individual, purchasing a good or service that's subject to sales tax pays it where they're using it or where they buy it, where they live. So your Wyoming business is not at any disadvantage against a Colorado business if you adopt a higher sales tax rate than Colorado if it's on personal consumption. But when it is on the intermediate transactions, when it's on all of those stages of production in between, if it's taxed here, it's not taxed in Colorado, it's not taxed in another state, now it's a tax on production. It's a tax on doing certain activity here, and it can be quite substantial because it does pyramid. It goes multiple times into the same final product. Often people say pyramiding means that it's embedded multiple times in the price. That actually depends. It depends on whether you have a regional or a national or international global market. There's a law of one price in economics. People are not willing to pay more most of the time just because you paid more in taxes. They pay based on what the market will bear. So if you're competing with a Colorado company and a Nebraska company and who knows, maybe a New York company, and they can all ship a product here and they did not have those business inputs taxed, they might be able to offer a lower price. They might be able to undercut a Wyoming business. Or a Wyoming business might just have to accept a much, much lower profit margin. Now, if it's more of a regional product, if it's something that you can only buy here or it's a service that has to be provided here, then the pyramiding is going to mainly be borne by the consumer. Either way, you're hurting Wyomingites. You're either creating much higher final prices that are much more than just the sales tax rates would suggest, or you are undercutting your business's competitive advantage compared to other firms. This is what a sales tax on business inputs does. And yours is very significant there. So if you either expand it to include more of that, to broaden the base, to include more of those business purchases, or if you raised your current rate on a tax that already has a very broad base of business-to-business activity, you are doubling down on that. So a lot of the discussion of could we shift from the property tax to the sales tax, I would just encourage you to think of what are the economic effects. Which one is going to make it harder to do business in Wyoming? Which one is going to have more of an effect on whether people can stay here, can find jobs here? This is already in some ways an expensive state in which to do business. A low margin business is just the population, the low density. There are costs to doing business here. And there are a lot of great things about Wyoming, but you have to be cognizant of that. And I think that's one of the reasons why Wyoming has tried to maintain its low tax status to sort of compensate for some of the other costs. But shifting the burden to that would undermine a lot of what Wyoming has tried to do over the years. I don't really want to talk too much about some of the other proposals out there. I just, especially in the interest of time, given that I know that we are, I think, approaching time. But there is a revenue stability also associated with the residential property tax that you don't see in a lot of taxes. And you don't see it in your mineral taxes, as the previous presenter noted, or one of the previous presenters noted. So you'd be giving up a lot of stability. And that's really important here, where you do have a much narrower array of taxes. Right now, your revenues look pretty good. I testified here on a proposal on corporate income taxation a few years ago. And I was pretty critical of that proposal because they would raise, I think the last one was like $24 million for a whole lot of effort and for high effective rates of taxation on certain businesses. But that was on the table because revenues didn't look so great. And 24 million wasn't going to solve that problem, but it was on the table because a lot of things had to be on the table. Right now, revenues look pretty good, and certainly reserves are really good, and that's wonderful. But if you want to maintain the competitive advantage you have in other taxes, you need to be very careful in seriously eroding the taxes that you have right now. This is a pretty good one. It's not a perfect one, but it's a pretty good one. And I would be very concerned, even if you can afford it in this snapshot, this moment in time, what it would mean if you've dramatically reduced it or even eliminated a classification of it, and then tax revenues decline again at state level, at the local level, and you have to replace that. You have to think about what do you do then, because you're probably not going to easily bring the property tax back. So I recognize these are hard choices. I understand there's a lot of pressure. I understand that people are upset, but you do have very low residential property taxes, as previous presenters have already noted. You are about half, depends on the measure, but you are under half or at half of the average effective rates in the rest of the country. And sure, residential property values have risen, and therefore, even though the effective rates haven't changed much, the amount people are paying has risen. You still have some of the lowest property taxes per capita as a percentage of personal income. Choose almost any measure, you are among the lowest. You're in the bottom 5. And I heard public comment earlier, why make the comparison? Isn't the goal just the best for Wyoming? And of course it is. 49 other states do something bad, you don't have to do it. But again, this is a pretty good tax, and you're already very low on it. I would encourage you all to, even in the things you've already adopted, to think about how sustainable they are in the long run. There will inevitably be changes to assessment limits. What should those look like? Should you be switching more to something like a levy limit? You have a variety of limitations and they interact with each other, but should you be providing relief and limitation in a way that doesn't distort the decision-making of individuals and homeowners and doesn't make housing in the long run less affordable, especially for new entrants? You want to provide some relief, but I'm not sure that the ways that have been adopted have been all the best ways. And this is not meant as a criticism, it is very tough. I think every legislator across the country right now is facing a lot of pressure to solve this problem, and some things make an immediate impact and speak directly to a problem, but they may not be the right answer. So I would encourage you, even with what you've adopted, to think about these collectively, coherently, to say, how could we comprehensively address these, maybe improve what we've done in the future so that we can provide some relief, some limitation, but maybe in a more economically neutral way. And also to encourage you to think very, very carefully about further eviscerating the property tax. It does have an important place. It is a fairly good tax. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Walzak. Any questions? Representative Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that presentation. Just a couple of comments and questions. You were talking about transparency, and you were talking about the people have control, but in fact, they don't. They buy at a certain rate, at a certain agreement, then the next thing you know, take a perfect example of recent history. Let's just take your 46%, or let's take 70%. All of a sudden, you don't have control. So that control is gone. But the real question I have as you move forward into this, you made a couple of items. You said nationwide 46%. So I'm kind of curious, what are the top 3 things driving that? And the reason I asked that question, because you made another statement. Maybe I didn't hear it right, but you said tax rates are going up, but tax revenues collected are going down. Now that to me, now maybe I didn't hear it right, so I want to understand that, because those 2 things are interesting, because that might tell a different tale, and I want to understand those 2. Thank you.
Mr. Walzak.
Representative Locke, through the chair. So thank you for allowing me to clarify that tax rates have not gone up. Nominal collections, the dollar amount of collections has risen before inflation adjustment. But once you adjust those collections for inflation, they have declined. And rates have gone down. They've actually gone down quite substantially, because most jurisdictions across the country, sometimes as part of a state policy that forced it down, sometimes because local governments adopted lower millages, millages have dramatically reduced. I know this isn't you, but I was just looking at Colorado the other day for something separate on property taxes, and their property tax rates have gone down by 50% over the last decade. That doesn't mean their collections have gone down. It's just that assessed values are rising dramatically, and their solution to this was reduce the rate and still collect just as much, if not more revenue, because the values were rising so much. And we've seen examples of that across the country. So rates are lower than they were a few years ago. Collections in nominal dollars are higher than they were a few years ago. Collections in real terms are lower. That doesn't, but of course, what's true nationally and what's true in aggregate is not true for every person. So that doesn't mean that no one has a legitimate complaint. It doesn't mean that there aren't policy solutions that we need to address. As for what has driven this, a lot of things. Demand for property, demand for housing exploded during the pandemic. And I think part of it was because of the pandemic, and part of it was just a natural transition. My generation, millennials, seem to have just been really a lot slower to get into single-family homes than everyone else, but it doesn't mean that we weren't going to. We were just a little late on it. And suddenly you have an awful lot of people who want housing, and in a lot of the country you had housing shortages. So in parts of the country it was because of restrictions on building housing. In other parts of the country, especially the Mountain West, it's not because there were restrictions so much, but just suddenly there's this huge boom in demand that it's hard to accommodate immediately. And also, perhaps because of the pandemic and remote work, a lot of interest in living in this part of the country, and a lot of desire, to live in some of, in certain jurisdictions. So you just see this dramatically increased demand. You see more turnover. I think during the pandemic, people wanted to live alone. So property values rose really dramatically. They're leveling off, but I think they'll remain much higher. I don't think anyone anticipates that you're going to see a collapse in these values. So they're higher. And it does not make sense that government should raise a ton more money because the value of the property is higher, because providing the services to those properties doesn't cost more just because their value is higher. Now, it does cost more because inflation's higher, but not because of the property values above and beyond inflation. That's why a levy limit can make sense. That's why jurisdictions rolling back their rates is appropriate, so that they're not getting this massive unlegislated tax increase. But some solutions like assessment limits may be doing that in a more, I think, distortive way.
Mr. Locke, Representative Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the clarification on it was inflation adjusted, and that part didn't quite sneak out. So thank you. The next question I have, though, is a lot of this conversation is focused on the need for revenue and the driving force there. So the question is, how much is taken into consideration on the consequences of the taxpayer? So for example, yes, there's inflation. Yes, it's going up. What's the consequence on the taxpayer in terms of the percentage of their income that is required for them to even own and buy a home? How much of that is factored into this analysis? Because that's ultimately the issue most of us are fighting, quite honestly, is it doesn't do any good to continue to crush the people that are paying the dollars. And that's the thing. And assuming that this inflation and this increase, this thing that's driving the prices up is going to carry you to the end, that's not always betting on that horse isn't always probably the best thing to do. So this whole issue of crushing the bottom end of the market, and I understand there's other factors there, but I'd just like to hear a little bit more about the consideration for the consequences on the overall taxpayer base.
Representative Locke, through the chair. Property taxes as a percentage of personal income are actually declining, not rising, and not by a lot, but they're actually declining. And this makes sense when you look at the fact that wages and compensation generally have risen faster than inflation. Now, an important proviso here is that nothing like that is ever uniform. Some people got the salary adjustments. Some people didn't. If you didn't, this is not a good deal. This is why inflation at these levels is a really bad thing. No one wants to have the inflation that we have had. But we have not seen significant national or Wyoming increases in property taxes, either in inflation adjusted, like real terms collections, or in property taxes as a percentage of personal income. So by both measures, I recognize those are different and they're both important. So speaking to your concern, I think the personal income measure, this is really the ability to pay measure. And we have not seen that in aggregate. Now again, aggregates are great, and they're the thing we have to usually work with. But I recognize that aggregates cannot speak to every individual situation. If you're in a jurisdiction that did not lower property taxes, that's really tough. If you lost your job or got a lower salary job during a high inflation environment, that's really tough. And we have to care about all of these things. But that's going to be true for every possible tax that we could impose. So if we're asking, has the property tax become more or less affordable? The answer is somewhere between the same and maybe even a little more affordable.
I'll come back to you because we've got others that want to jump in the fray here. We'll go with Senator Ride and come to Representative Bear and keep going.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your shortcomings on the Nebraska EPIC option, I've looked at that a little bit in the past. You've got in here, your calculations suggest a rate of 22% would be required. Do you have that data? Do you have a report on that where we could look at how you guys did your calculations? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Walczak.
Senator, through the chair, yes, we have a publication. There's an image of it on the screen. It's on our website. We go through all of this, and we have a methodology section in the appendix. There's also two other organizations that have done this. There is there's an in-state group that ideologically differs from us and has come up with an estimate that's, I think, 0.3% different than us in the realm of talking about the 22% rates. I think those are the same. And then the chamber did a rougher estimate and came up with 20 to 25%. So I think everyone is landing in the same place except the proponents. I don't want to go into all the details, but just because this feels weird, right? Like someone saying 7.5% and we're out here saying 22%. I want to briefly explain where I think they went terribly wrong. They used the measure of all personal consumption expenditures, which is federal government data, and then they made a lot of adjustments in their policy. They're excluding a lot of things. They did not make those adjustments in their calculations. They made very few adjustments. So personal consumption expenditures includes property, like occupancy of property. That's both the implicit rent on ownership of property, that there's like a consumption element of living in the property you already fully own. There's also the actual rent you might pay if you have a mortgage or if you have, or if you're paying rent. So they include that in personal consumption. They're not taxing it under the proposal, but they include that in their base when they're doing the calculations. They also include all healthcare and all private education in their calculations, but they don't include them in what they intend to tax. They include some interstate commerce that they definitionally cannot tax. They tax the consumption. They tax spending by state and local government, which is completely circular. They think it raises revenue, but if the government taxes itself, it might redistribute in the government where it goes, but if it's taxing itself, it doesn't raise any revenue. They also tax the salaries of local government officials, which is a problem, I would think, but I guess you could do that. We include what they could do, but they also tax federal government officials. That's illegal. They tax a bunch of things that are unconstitutional in their calculations, but not as part of what they say they're taxing. So basically, I don't think they understood what the measure was, like when they were using personal consumption. So they used a base that was about 2.5 times what their actual base is, and then they made a number of other calculation errors along the way. It creates a radically different picture when you're done.
Okay. Representative Bear, to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the audience, I don't believe we got a chance to hear your bona fides and where it is your organization's from. If you could just share that with us, and then I have a question for you after that.
Representative Bear, through the chair, yes. I am Vice President of State Projects with the Tax Foundation. We are a DC-based policy organization, essentially a think tank. We've been around since 1937, and we've a state team, the team I run, since about the year 2000. We work with policymakers in all 50 states. We also have teams that do federal tax policy and increasingly global tax policy. In fact, we just opened an office in Brussels doing EU tax policy. Our focus is on ensuring a competitive pro-growth tax code. We want simplicity, neutrality, transparency, stability, and a pro-growth environment. Our focus tends to be much more on tax structure than on tax collections. Now, if you have really high taxes, you have probably some problems. But our goal primarily is to say, whatever level of revenue a government wants to raise, you can do it better or worse. And we would like to help you do it in the more economically efficient way, the less distortive way, the way that promotes economic growth. So that is our goal as an organization, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. Our website is taxfoundation.org. We have a lot of resources there. We do this. We work directly with legislators, answer questions, and we have a lot of resources for regular taxpayers as well, including like educational materials that are designed for taxpayers who want to understand these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that. And I just wanted a little clarification. One of the things that you said that if costs of business are high, you create, economic issues for your state. And so by shifting the burden to businesses, you intimated that we would likely reduce the opportunity for revenue because businesses would see the cost too high. But isn't it true that one of the highest costs to operate almost any business is labor? And labor cost in the state of Wyoming is high because we don't have a lot of supply of that. Whereas when you have a reduction in the cost of housing and the kind of things that you mentioned, attracting people to the state of Wyoming, you're actually increasing the potential for supply of labor, therefore reducing the cost of business. Would that be an accurate statement?
Representative Vera, through the chair. At some level, yes, I would agree with you that, again, whatever you tax, you get less of, and there are multiple effects. If you increase the cost of labor, if you increase taxes on labor, you reduce the return to labor. Now, the more direct way to do that would be like an individual income tax. That's a direct tax on labor force participation. The residential property tax is not a tax on labor force participation. It doesn't really take into account, but it does, of course, increase your cost of living here compared to not having it. That's going to be true of all taxes. All taxes are increasing some costs. So the question is, I guess, twofold. Which ones are most affecting what we care about, labor, and which ones are going to actually be a fulcrum of decision making? So the residential property tax is going to have far less of an effect on that than a tax on capital accumulation or a tax that might flip profitability to loss for a business. So you have a lot of businesses in Wyoming that are going to not only just by definition be sort of low profit margin businesses, but are going to probably have more struggle because of the low density. Take, for instance, retail. Like grocery stores typically have a profit margin. Their margins are like 1.5% to 2.5%. That's really low. So any change in the tax wedge can be quite difficult for them, and they can pass a fair amount of that along. But in a state where already you have like relatively limited access to stores in some parts of the state because of the low density, any sort of cost that might shift hours, availability, things like that might push something further away. Those are concerns. Manufacturing in the state, other activity in the state, these things are going to be more expensive. Absolutely, taxing labor has an effect on this. And there's economic studies that sort of look at the hierarchy of how much it affects investment in the state, business in the state. Taxes on capital are going to have the largest effect on business activity and productivity in the state. Taxes on labor are going to come after that. Taxes on consumption are going to come after that. And then taxes on residential real property are going to be at the lowest. It doesn't mean zero. I agree with the effect you're talking about, but it's going to be a much, much smaller effect. And then, of course, remember that people have to live somewhere regardless, and they're going to pay property taxes regardless. They're almost certainly going to pay more just about anywhere else in property taxes. Now, I recognize that when you already have some constraints, where there's already limited labor supply, you say, well, what's the next advantage we can grab? But this is an area where you're already better than most, and where the additional return would be relatively low. I think that you don't want to shift onto something where the losses are much larger for your economy.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Wozniak, because I know you spent, it's probably been 6 years now in various roles dealing with Wyoming, looking at our tax structure and everything we do. While I have you up there, what should we be doing better to improve tax structure? I think you've rated us number one for quite a while now. But if there's any improvements, what could we be doing?
Representative, through the chair, you have a number of areas where I think there are opportunities for improvement. The sales tax is one of those areas. It's not your rate. Your rate is perfectly fine. And honestly, if it were higher, it wouldn't be much of a concern. It is the base. It is a base that is predominantly business inputs, and again, that is either driving up the costs for consumers much more than the sales tax on the actual consumption is, or it is meaning that business activity is not happening here that should happen here that would create jobs here and create more opportunity here. I would take the opportunity to, as you can, reduce those intermediate transactions being the sales tax base. I don't say eliminate just because I'm a realist, and no state has eliminated B2B taxation, their sales tax. If I were creating one from scratch, I would say, please try that, but you're not, and I recognize that's a very heavy lift. But other states have made serious efforts to curtail. Utah is a very good regional model of a state that probably over like 6 or 7 discrete bills over the course of 15 or 20 years has incrementally reduced the taxation of business inputs. Sometimes they've gone category by category. They've said, like, okay, where are we overtaxing industrial? Let's fix the industrial code. Then, let's go to, like sort of like going by category. Sometimes they've just sort of taken a broad brush, like where are a variety of ways that we can reduce this. But they still tax B2B, but I think they probably tax about half as much as you do, and that makes an enormous difference. So I think there are models there. I think that would be really important. Tangible personal property taxation, that machinery, equipment, things like this. This is a tax on the decision to invest, and it distorts investment decisions. It means that you have to, replacing property faster or expanding property is taxed. This, whatever you tax, you get less of. Why would you tax investments? That's one of the last things you would choose to tax. But also it's a tax that is taxpayer active, that businesses have to track the acquisition date, the acquisition price, figure out which depreciation schedule it's on. If there have been repairs or maintenance that adjust that, they have to adjust that as well. And it applies no matter what the size of your business. So there was discussion in the last couple of years of eliminating it, and I think repeal would be a wonderful thing. About 15 states, I believe, don't have any tangible personal property tax. By the way, that's red states, blue states, purple states. It's a pretty good mix of states that just do not tax tangible personal property. In the last couple of years, Rhode Island's eliminated a lot of it. Wisconsin just eliminated it entirely. It's significant focus on that. But even if you don't go that far, something that I think is a really, really light lift is a meaningful de minimis exemption. Almost all of your neighbors have them.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, and I know you weren't here this morning, there was a map provided from the Tax Foundation that we don't quite, even though we have a de minimis on the books, we don't hit whatever the definition in your world is. You have, what would that be to be on equal footing of the other de minimis states?
Balzac.
The Chair, and I hope I have this right on yours, but I believe that yours is constrained. It's both, I think, a low dollar value, but it's also based on certain property and not an aggregate. And I could be mistaken on that. And if we're missing something, we'll be happy to correct this. But Montana has a 300,000. Idaho has, I believe, well, they have 100,000 now, but I think they're going to $1 million, which I'm not saying you need to go to $1 million. That's actually very high. But a lot of states are $50,000 or $100,000 before you have to pay anything, and also very significantly, you do not have to file, because the taxpayer active part is the issue. So I mentioned there's depreciation schedules, but there's also supplies which are consumable and therefore they don't depreciate, they're just sort of gone. So theoretically, a lot of businesses don't really do this, but you're supposed to. If you have a small business, I don't care how small, and in the office kitchen, you've got some disposable plates, you've got some trash bags, maybe you put up some Christmas lights outside. Those are supplies. You have to list those. The paper towels have to be accounted for, and you have to pay for them. It doesn't matter if it's cents. You have to do it. And your de minimis exemption, I think, helps with some of that. But for a lot of businesses, I don't think it's applying. And you have to track all of that. So the question is, how many of them can you just take off the rolls? Can you say, don't have to deal with this at all? It's not just how much you're paying. I have a friend who's a state legislator in another state that has no exemption. He's a real estate agent in addition to being a state legislator. The only property he really has is some signs and some of those locks and like a few things like this. He pays about $7 every year in tangible property taxes. He has to spend about 3 hours documenting it. I think that's a really bad use of everyone's time, and I actually bet that by the time his county finishes processing a $7 return, they haven't made anything. So, the evidence of, when you look at the fiscal impact notes or the state fiscal statements in other states when they've done this, they're so trivial. Colorado going to $50,000, I think their fiscal note was $20 million statewide. And I think their experience is that they've radically overshot. It's going to be way less than that. Utah adopted something. It's now up to about $25,000. They did it in 3 stages. They've never had to do a fiscal estimate because I think each one of them, they figured it was less than $50,000, so it didn't have to be scored. These things are trivial in their cost, but they make a big difference for businesses just in the day-to-day compliance. I think that's low-hanging fruit that's worth doing. And I apologize that I know you have something, and I'm not as well versed on it as I should be, but I'd be happy to take a greater look at it and maybe reach out to you and the commission on where that can be tightened up and look more like what other states have.
Thank you. Any further questions? Mr. Representative Locke, did you have anything else? No? I guess I have a question regarding, when you were talking, the fairness of the guy across the street and your house is the same, brought up the argument about taxation of unrealized capital gains. And it's obviously not fair in an investment situation. It would destroy investment markets if we were to start taxing unrealized capital gains in your portfolio, and would be patently unfair. But that's essentially what we're dealing with in real property, is it not?
Chairman, there is a degree to which, yes, the property tax is in a very narrow way a wealth tax. It is not a pure wealth tax by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a tax on an asset, and we don't have a lot of those. And we have to take that into account as we consider it, that it is different. It's not based on flows, and therefore there is not necessarily the liquidity. Now, property taxes, typically are set at rates where that level of affordability consideration is not the same as in an investment. If you have an investment portfolio and you are paying on unrealized gains, the mark-to-market treatment, you almost certainly would have to liquidate some of your investments to do that. You're probably not generally liquidating your property. So a big element of this is just that it doesn't have the same effect, that you're not distorting in the same way because you're probably not selling off pieces of your property to pay it, whereas you would be. Another aspect is that capital gains, that is an income tax, and therefore it is flows based by definition. So you're going to have these ebbs and flows, and you would have adjustments that 1 year you have gains, another year you have losses. How are we going to account for that? And most of the mark-to-market treatments don't do this very well. The argument against mark-to-market is not that it is theoretically indefensible, it is that it is practically fairly unworkable and that it creates a lot of distortions. In real property taxes, you have fewer of those sort of unworkable. You also, again, have a tax that is based more on the benefit principle, where you are paying for your local services, and the value of your property is a pretty decent proxy for that. It is not perfect, but no tax is perfect, and we are working within the realm of what is the closest to principles, what handles the trade-offs best, and property. All policies about trade-offs. You have identified a legitimate issue, that you have a tax that's essentially a tax on stock, not flows. And anytime you're doing that, you have these unrealized gains that are being subject to tax. But that is why I think levy limits are appropriate. Some sort of relief can be appropriate, but it needs to be well calibrated to the need, and it needs to be as least distortive as possible. Assessment limit doesn't accomplish that as well. Very high homestead exemptions do not accomplish that well. And eliminating the tax or radically reducing it for most payers, I think, would shift you towards much worse systems that would create far more distortions.
Any questions down here? Down here? Okay. Oh, yep, Representative Locke, he's awake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one question. You'd responded to that one question I'd asked about increasing the pressure on the taxpayer. One of the things, can you talk to that in the context of Wyoming's, this is general Wyoming, median household income fairly level for 10 years, right? We've seen pretty high increases in the last 4. And you said the pressure on taxpayers has actually decreased nationwide. Can you talk to that a little bit in the context of the fact our median household income is very level for 10 years? Thank you.
Mr. Walzak.
Representative Locke to the chair. So I think it was level for a long time, and that is a problem. I mean, you do not want, to have that sort of stasis. But you said a little change in the last 4 years, and I think that's what everyone's experienced, that, you have seen an increase in compensation. Wages have risen here and across the country over the last 4 years. Inflation has taken most of that back. So, it's not a wonderful situation, but again, it's an offsetting situation where, you've had higher compensation, higher inflation, so everything's more expensive. When you go to the store, it's more expensive in nominal terms. Your employer is paying you more. It's more expensive for them to employ you in nominal terms, but we wouldn't necessarily say in real terms because it's basically an inflation adjustment. Your property taxes are more in nominal terms, but probably not in real terms. If you had an individual income tax, I'm glad you don't, but if you had an individual income tax, you would be paying more in nominal terms because even though your rate would be unchanged, and we'll assume it's a flat tax, so it's not like you go into a higher bracket or anything, but just, flat rate, you'd be paying the same effective rate, but you'd be making more in nominal terms, so you would be paying more. We wouldn't say that was an increase in your taxes in real terms, though, because you pay more because you earn more. Here, too, obviously, there's a slight disconnect. We don't know that you as an individual are earning more just because your property is higher value, but we do know in aggregate that wages have risen, that income in Wyoming and income across the country is higher now, that inflation takes back most of that, and that we expect to see that inflation bite in everything, including in taxes. It makes sense to inflation adjust all of this. And when you look at your budget, when you plan for future expenditures, you take into account inflation. Local governments have to as well. So again, in real terms, property taxes are a little lower now. I know that's not, that is not that's not good for everyone. And I recognize that there are going to be people who are hit by this, and that's why these high levels of inflation are a very, very real problem. But I don't think it's a problem you can entirely solve through the property tax, and I think that some of the mechanisms that you might use to try to address it would make the overall system worse and honestly lead to more economic costs for some of the individuals you're trying to help.
Representative Locke, I think I'll jump in because I think I know what you're asking, and I'll try to phrase it in a different way. The number we saw this morning for our income, the average household income is about, what, 71,000 I saw on a slide? And that's been pretty much flat, pretty much as in flat, over the past 10 years. And I think that's the point he's making. Our assessed valuations for residential property in Wyoming since 2019 has gone up 68%. Some counties, 112%. The lowest amount is 19.5%. People's wages didn't go up that much. So that's where in the counties where people are seeing over 100% increase since COVID, they're screaming because they're not seeing their services go up. They're not seeing their income go up. They're just paying more in taxes. So I think that's the question Representative Locke is trying to ask.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Locke, thank you. I do appreciate that. And yes, to the extent that wages have not risen and the assessed values have risen that much, that is a huge problem. Even with wages rising, if we just looked at assessed valuations rising, like I said, across the country, that has risen way faster than inflation without some sort of millage, some sort of rate adjustment, you have a very significant problem. Now, there have been rate adjustments in Wyoming. I think it's been insufficient. I think it's been inconsistent, and that is why a lot of this is coming to the state legislature to resolve. But you can resolve this problem through a levy limit. You do not need to resolve it through an assessment limit, because a levy limit would also look and say, let's say that you're in a jurisdiction where assessed values have risen 100%, which is pretty horrifying if you're receiving that. And let's just, for sake of argument, say that like we would allow a 10% increase to account for some aspect of inflation or something. I might not be right, but just like, we'll just say that. So you've got to roll back 90% of that increase. That would be what a levy limit would do. Now, what it wouldn't do is say your assessed value didn't rise. Your assessed value did rise. Your assessed value may still have doubled, but your rates roughly cut in half. The difference in these two approaches is that it still allows the value of your property compared to other people's properties to be real, to be market rates, and that's really important. So the focus, these are very legitimate concerns, and I think there's been efforts to address this, but the approach should be a levy limit. If, Chairman Beitman, if your property happens to rise in value more than your neighbor's, you should probably pay more than your neighbor. Doesn't mean you should pay double. It just means that the actual value of your properties should be reflected in your property tax bills. And that's what a levy limit can do, that an assessment limit, I think, gets at the wrong way. I also would say that you have to consider where you're starting from, that you do have very, very low property taxes. Even when they rise, they're pretty low. And this is one of the few sources of revenue that local governments have. And it is and you are a state that doesn't have a lot of other taxes, which I think is a wonderful thing. So when you're thinking about limitations, you both have to think about how strictly do we want to constrain this, because we want to make sure this tax is available for us so we don't have to shift onto something else. And that may mean allowing more increases than another state would, where they have a lot of other taxes and their property taxes are much higher and they're disproportionate to their other taxes, which is not your situation. But also, to the extent we do want to constrain them, how do we choose to constrain them in a way that is not ultimately making the problem worse? You want property values to be reflected in property taxes, and that's where what was adopted this year, I think, starts to move you away from. And I would encourage, this joint committee, the Joint Commission, and the legislature as a whole to consider how you provide the legitimate property tax relief, the legitimate limitations to make sure that when assessed values double, people don't pay double property taxes. That makes no sense whatsoever, but that it's done in a way that allows both states, the local governments to have the revenue they need, and also for the economy to thrive.
Follow up on that, because I would be for the mill levies being adjustable. I think that's the smartest thing to do, but we have a constraint in Wyoming called the Wyoming Education Association. And it's political suicide to cut education spending, and our mill levies are basically set in stone. They're not gonna drop the 12 mills for education. That's just not gonna happen. We'll get sued, and we'll get sued again and again into oblivion, and we'll all get voted out of office. That's just political reality. So with that basically being off the table, we're left with caps, whether it's and lowering the assessment rate. But we also have a thing in the Constitution that says our residential assessment rate can't be more than 4.5%, so we'd have to bring them all down. And then it's just, so you can see where we're at. And that's why we went with the cap, because it's the easiest thing to do. Your thoughts on that?
Chairman, it's a very good point. There are always political constraints, and this is a very difficult area. And I have the benefit of speaking of this more from the perspective of what's good policy look like, and you also have to balance a lot of other concerns that are part of doing policy, but that are not on me. But I try to reflect those realities because I want to work in the real world. I would, I guess, ask how much of a real difference. I understand that no one wants to give up their mill rates. The mills are important to education, to everything else, but what is the difference for them, for anyone, in rolling back the mills on a much higher assessed value and capping the assessed value at a much higher mill rate? it is hard for me to see why one is better than the other for those who are simply seeking the revenue, other than to say that, honestly, if you're concerned about education or anything in the future, you probably don't want to be shifting disproportionately the burden to those who are going to move in. Wyoming is not unique in having trouble with retaining and growing population. The more that you benefit the longtime incumbent homeowners at the expense of new homeowners, which is what assessment limits will do, I think it's going to be harder in the long run to have the growth you need that will allow you to fund schools and roads and just have the society that everyone wants. So I understand exactly what you're saying, but I'm not sure that there's really the difference there that, 100% increase in assessed values and 50%, reduction in rates is the same thing as a no increase in assessed value and, the rates stay. I mean, it is economically the same at that level, but it's radically different economically in what it does for your future investment.
Okay. Yes, Representative Storer.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a few observations for the conversation here. Maybe ask you to respond to, Mr. Walczak. I do think when we're talking about these average numbers that we've been seeing, we have to consider that much of what these numbers represents valuations in Teton County. That where you've seen the biggest rate increases is on the highest valuation of properties that we have. And what we're really trying to address here, more so, I think, is looking at what happens at what is more the average homeowner and trying to address that. And to some degree, we've tried to do that through a few different ways, both exemptions and the refund program. And I'm curious whether you have, Director Henson kind of put that to us earlier today. Like, we've broadened, we've included more exemptions and we broadened the refund program. And it's particularly difficult when you have such variations in the valuations across the board. But the other part that's tricky for Wyoming too is that we're funding schools statewide through our property tax. And so what you see happening is you are seeing the valuations and that's making a difference in what the state has available to it, especially coming from Teton County where our school district is now like several of our other districts throughout the state that have been mineral recapture districts that have such excess valuation that then it comes back to the state. And we're seeing that to now happening in Teton County with residential property taxes. So just trying to figure out what actually makes sense. And we haven't really figured out, we made big cuts in school funding a few years ago, and we saw what that cost, not only in litigation, but what it's meant for kids. So there is a resistance to really drop those values down. So at the end of the day, I think trying to think about how we are really trying to address the problems that we have and recognizing these differentiations. Whether you have any comments about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, through the chair. So there are a variety of different, we brought up a couple points, so hopefully I get to all of them, and if I forget anything, please remind me. So some of the exclusions, some of the other property tax relief mechanisms that were provided, whether it's certain exemption amounts or circuit breakers, these, because they're a certain dollar amount often, or limited to a certain dollar amount, they do benefit, lower cost housing much more than higher cost housing. So they're like, it might be the same dollar amount in Teton County and another county, but obviously it's a much larger percentage of your property value. That makes it progressive. It makes it often popular. And in some ways, it affects affordability because, you might have people who are on lower incomes or fixed incomes or, more constrained may be in those jurisdictions or in those lower income houses, like lower cost houses. That's really important. The flip side is that those jurisdictions can lose a lot of their base very quickly in ways that Teton County wouldn't lose as much of its base when you create those exemptions. And that can create huge problems for local government that a one-size-fits-all policy doesn't fit when you're talking dollar amount exemptions. Now, when we're talking things like levy limits, they're by definition county. And assessment limits are by definition individual property. So they don't have the regional distortions. Now, assessment limits have a lot of other distortions, but they don't have the regional distortions, either of those types of limits, because regardless of what county you're in, it's going, like a levy limit is going to be calibrated to functionally the assessed value increase of all of the existing properties across the county. Doesn't matter what another county is doing, it's going to be within your county, how much additional revenue you would raise on that. An assessment limit is obviously going to be individual to each parcel, and is going to cap it. Both of those are not going to create this sort of county by county distortions. If Teton County has had a much higher increase in values, then either its assessment limits there would cap it even lower, or levy limits at the county level would roll it back more. But it gets messy when you use statewide, because then it starts to redistribute. And, and a statewide system starts to change the dynamics of that, where the benefit might be accruing more to those who are in the largest houses, the higher income areas, or may change the revenue picture. So you don't want to do it that way. But I think that the concerns you're raising would not really be a problem if there's a levy limit, and they also wouldn't be a problem if jurisdictions individually just chose to adopt lower millages, which maybe is pie in the sky thinking, but they could do that to try to keep things in check. It's not a huge issue with assessment limits. Again, I've raised a lot of other concerns I have about them, but it's not a huge issue there. But it is very much an issue when we're talking about other types of exemptions, whether it's based on, say, age or income or value of the property, or if it's just a set amount like a homestead exemption. Those things are going to be very different across jurisdictions.
Did we solve all the world's problems? More questions than answers? Okay. Mr. Walczak, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time today, and thanks for coming out to Wyoming.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll open up to public comment. Is there anybody who wish to comment publicly? Okay. Oh, Ms. Vaughn?
Rosemary Spot, Natrona County resident. I had a question. This is pertaining to the mill levy, that we could limit that. And there's another problem with that I see right offhand. That you want to have no bearing on the assessment value, so it keeps people's property prices up. And I understand that for a seller's standpoint, but that's not helping with the insurance rate problem we have right now, because insurance are being compared to the assessment cost. And I just got told by my insurance provider that my insurance went up $500, and there's only one provider that's providing for rural properties. And to be honest, I only have 2 structures on my property of many structures that are covered, and I'm paying $2,400 a year. That's $200 a year to be on my own property. And I already had one house fire, so I don't dare go without it. So that's something that needs to be really, really thought about, committee. I don't know that this testimony is somebody that's, there was so much comment about that rate, and that was answered by you guys. You questioned it, that our wages have gone up. The median income value is flatlined. We haven't, and thank you for asking that question and getting to the bottom of it, because that's not even a good valuation for testimony. Again, the fact that 73% of property taxes is funding schools, I think there's a lot that could be cut from the schools. And I provided you with, one example a moment ago. But it should be a merit system, that if they haven't got good test scores, that throwing more money at a problem isn't helping anything. And another example, like this building that we're in right now, this was a poor location, in my opinion. It should have been located over there on the Amoco property where the State Oil and Gas Commission is located, the other state buildings, and this property should have been left for the future expansion that school will want to do. It's poor planning. And these are things that, I'm bringing you this information because I talk to the people. I don't know, some of y'all seem like you get elevated and you're not part of the people anymore. And some of you work really hard, and I'm trying to be that bridge for you, if you can appreciate that. Again, we're saying that less or half, of the property tax, compared to other states. I don't care what other states are doing, and I'm pretty sure that the people in Wyoming don't care about what other states are doing. And, looking at numbers, I worked in the oil field. I worked in safety positions. I was a crane operator. I could go on about my credentials and everything, but you can make numbers look any way that you want. So saying that these numbers it's not, there's common sense. Where does common sense come into play for the government? Because this is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, last time I checked. This seems like what I heard from a testimony. This is, I guess, to summarize and end this, it sounded like a uniform tax approach. And instead of supporting the constitutional approach that the power lies within the state, I don't care what the federal government wants for us. This is Wyoming. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you very much. Eve, anybody on Zoom?
No, sir, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Public comment is closed. That's it for the day. Yay. We'll do committee directives since we've been skipping them all day. We accidentally missed them this morning. So we're just going to do committee directives at the end of the meeting tomorrow. So come up with your bill draft ideas that you want to work on next meeting, and we'll talk about them at the end of the day tomorrow, all at once, so we can get them all done. With that. Oh, yes, and we're going to have a reception and probably immediately following this big old gavel hitting the table here over at, what is it, the pizza place, Rocca's, with Jared and the Taxpayers Association to ask more questions if we have them over there. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, this meeting is adjourned.